That's what I thought.
No, I hung out with my dog and like from bed takes me.
Yeah. I had that second.
Hey, welcome everybody. Grab a seat, grab a coffee, grab a cookie. We're so excited to welcome OpenSecrets here to Albuquerque. And we're on the units of really
My colleague Michael.
I used to work there years ago.
I know.
not just journalists, but all members of the but particularly we're focused on journalists today. My name is Mike Marcotte. I am the professor of practice in journalism here at the UNM Communications and Journalism Department. And we're co-hosting, which all that means is we kind of help find the site and help get some people here. Welcome to my advanced journalism students back there. Maintain that enthusiastic. That's it. I'm just here to welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Thanks to our friends at OpenSecrets for what we do. We're really excited to get into the content of this. We are live streaming. Welcome to those of you who are out there somewhere. I hope the feed goes well for you. So without further ado, shall I pass it up to?
Thank you so much for having us. We really, truly appreciate it. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, no, we're glad you're here. And by the way, nice weather we're having. We're actually loving this weather. You might not realize that.
It's not quite what we were expecting. Thank you all so much for coming out today, and thank you so much to the University of New Mexico for hosting us and for everyone for collaborating with us today. We have a really exciting agenda featuring some of our secrets, as well as featuring some recent changes in the law in New Mexico as well. We are grateful to have Secretary of State's office joining us today to discuss some of the recent changes and some new details and information related to finance disclosure and exposing our county. Thank you all so much for coming out today, especially with snowy, rainy weather. And if you do have any questions, please let us know. We have some Q&A scheduled throughout the course of the event. there's cookies and coffees in the back with waters. Please feel free to get up at any point and help yourselves. There's some handouts by the door with our map of New Mexico dark money tracking, a copy of the agenda, a glossary of some key terms that you might hear, as well as copies of the New Mexico election handbook, courtesy of the Secretary of State's office. We're going to kick it off with a talk by Secretary of State Toulouse-Oliver in a couple of minutes, and then working our way into talk by New Mexico in depth, who's been gracious enough to share their time today as well. And then features some of OpenSecrets tools, and then break down to more of a Q&A and hands-on work to make sure you have the tools you need for journalism, for reporting, and other journalistic tools to cover money politics, dark money, political ads, and just a plethora of other resources going into the election cycle. Without further ado,
we're not quite sure where the mic is. Does anyone see anything that looks like a mic?
They're hanging from the ceiling.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, we'll use these candles. We just want to, from hearing from some of the online participants, it's difficult.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Perfect. Apologies to everyone who's tuned in online if you were unable to hear the first part of the event. I just wanted to welcome everyone who's been able to make it here in person, as well as everyone who's tuning in and on the call. We have a really exciting agenda today for tracking dark money and campaign finance issues more generally, as well as political ads. We have a lot of big tools to release and are really excited to get started on that. We're going to kick off our talk today with the Secretary of State's office. We're going to hear from New Mexico in depth about some recent reporting and efforts in the states, as well as some interesting tools from OpenSecrets, as well as recent developments in the state of New Mexico. We have about a 3-hour plan, so please feel free to help yourselves to coffee, to cookies, all of that. We have some Q&As throughout the course of the event, as well as more of a workshopping towards the end. But if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to let us know. If you have any issues, please come grab me or the research director at OpenSecrets, Sarah Bryner, who are here visiting from Washington, D.C. We're always more than happy to help. Without further ado, since I think we should be right on schedule, I will be kicking it off to the Secretary of State's office. We're lucky enough to have Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse-Oliver here today, joining us and sharing her time. And she will be starting with some of the recent changes to disclosure laws in New Mexico. Thank you so much for coming today. I really just truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just try to balance all of my stuff here. So likewise, thank you to the Center for Responsive Politics for hosting this event today, and thanks for all of you coming out. I see a lot of familiar faces, folks that my office works with quite a bit on the subject, and I'm happy to see you all out here today. And to the students, it's exciting to have you all here as well. We have done a lot in New Mexico over the last couple of years with regard to trying to improve the transparency and the landscape of campaign finance in New Mexico. And of course, as with anything, there's still a lot more work to be done. And my office is very focused on that work and wanting to do as much as we can to improve that. But let me kick today off by starting to talk about the things that we have done so far, and then the things that we're kind of looking forward to doing moving forward. And for those of you who've particularly been working in the state for a long time, you know that New Mexico has sort of a long, fraught history of it being difficult to track down who is spending money on campaigns, how campaign money is being used, whether it's being used appropriately or not. We've had some unfortunate chapters in our state history as a result of the inappropriate use of campaign funds, right? So this is a really critically important issue. And may I say that it is an issue that thankfully the members of the press in this state have been really diligent about working on, and have you guys have taken your watchdog status very seriously, at which I, as a citizen and as an elected official who believes in good government and accountability, really appreciates. What we're trying to do in our office moving forward is to make it even easier for you to do that watchdog job. And it hasn't been a simple or an easy process. None of this ever is. We can't do things overnight, but over time, we are managing to achieve quite a few positive changes. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my thoughts cleared now, my thoughts on my notes. So we really do view the press in the state as being key to this transparency piece, because the reality is we know that just, the average everyday citizen doesn't either have the interest or the time to just go troll around on the campaign finance information system and, look up, such and such in my neighborhood is running for state house. I wonder where they're getting their money from, right? So that we are really dependent, of course, on the media to help get those stories out, to help look for those things. And we really do view it as a partnership because we do think that the role of our office is to make sure that that information is transparent and that it can be used for accountability purposes. So in that vein, I'm going to take you back to when I first came into the office in December of 2016. At that time, we were really struggling in New Mexico, particularly with regard to accountability and transparency around dark money. We had these unconstitutional laws on the books. The election code that you have in front of you right now, and I'll point you to the Campaign Reporting Act is Article 19 of the election code, chapter 19 of the election code. And we had whole swaths of that chapter that had been ruled unconstitutional as a result of Citizens United. And so we were really operating in a difficult place because we had these laws on the books. They were unconstitutional. We couldn't enforce them. We couldn't really do anything with them. And the legislature had made some attempts over the course of several legislative sessions to try to bring about fixes. Senator Peter Wirth in particular was a huge champion on this issue, but the legislature kept failing to either pass the legislation or, as was the case in 2017, when a bill was finally passed through both chambers of the New Mexico legislature, the governor, at that time, Governor Martinez, actually vetoed the legislation. So here we are, it's October of 2017, and we know that another election year is coming upon us in 2018, and we're going to continue to operate in the dark here in New Mexico. And so what I decided to do was to use the power of administrative rule that I have in my office to actually put in place these regulations that require disclosure of independent spending in campaigns. And what we did was we looked to states and to court rulings that had occurred post Citizens United, states that had tried to do similar things, and we basically drew on that case law, and we also drew on sort of what we knew of New Mexico and what happens here and what worked and doesn't work here to craft a rule that would pass constitutional muster. In other words, based on what other states did that were done within the confines of the Citizens United decision, we knew that we could draft an administrative rule that clarified our current laws to require this disclosure. And we went through, the whole process here in New Mexico. As elsewhere, the administrative rulemaking process is a very rigorous public process by which we post a draft rule. We have to have a 30-day open public comment period. We have to account for all of that public comment and digest it. We have to hold public hearings. We actually held 4 public hearings across the state. The statutory requirement is 1 to get public input and feedback into the rule. And then the final rule, once published, we had to give a very lengthy sort of legal explanation about not only what the rule was doing, but also how we had factored in all of that public comment into the final outcome. And what we came out with was basically a framework for requiring disclosure of these previously undisclosed independent expenditures in the state. And I'm assuming that we're all operating from sort of a basic knowledge of what I'm talking about when I say independent expenditures or dark money. But just to clarify, when you have an individual or an entity that is spending its own money to influence the outcome of an election, and we actually have a definition for what that looks like, you have to be advocating for or against a candidate on the ballot or a question on the ballot expressly. That is what is considered an independent expenditure for purposes of this disclosure. And we put some requirements around that, around how much you have to spend and what time period you have to spend it to report it. And then we created a whole new vehicle to report that spending because, as we'll get into here further in the presentation, while we have a campaign finance information system that many of you are familiar with that tracks the money raised and spent by PACs and candidates, we didn't have such a feature for these independent groups or independent individuals, right? You could just be one wealthy person and spend your money in a campaign. We didn't have a way to track that, so we actually had to develop a completely different system to accommodate for the filing and disclosure of that information online as well, which we did pursuant to the rule. So that rule went into effect in late 17. It was on the books throughout the entire 2018 election cycle, and we had disclosure. We had disclosure not only through the purely independent expenditure portal that we developed to just handle these groups that were, or people that were spending their own money, but we had a lot of disclosure actually come through the main campaign finance information system because within the context of the rule, we created this concept by which you can be a PAC, a registered PAC in the state of New Mexico, and you can be raising and spending money in a coordinated way with candidates and political parties, but then you can also have an independent, non-coordinated side, and they were reporting that raising and spending through our campaign finance information system proper. So we had quite a bit of disclosure throughout the 2018 cycle. Funny enough, coming into this year, early this year, as we were gearing up for the legislative session, and we were going into the legislative session with a goal of getting these administrative rules codified into state statute, and to not only codify the rules we had written, but to also make some changes to state law that I did not have the power to do by administrative rule, right? There were certain things that only the state legislature could affect that I didn't have the independent authority to do. So as we were coming into the session, ironically, we were slapped with a lawsuit that we had been threatened with throughout the entire administrative rule process, but that never materialized throughout the entire 2018 election cycle, arguing that what I had done was unconstitutional. It was an unconstitutional power grab. I'm accused quite a bit of unconstitutional power grabs. The case was dismissed. One of the arguments that was raised was that it was, this very urgent matter that needed to be dealt with immediately, and I think the justices in this case found wasn't that urgent because we went through a whole election cycle with a rule in place and nobody said anything. So that case was dismissed during the course of the legislative session. Meanwhile, we were working very diligently with the legislature to get these rules codified. And the context in which we passed this, the context in which we codified these rules was through Senate Bill 3. For those of you who are familiar with the legislative session, the earlier or the lower a number it is means the earlier the bill was introduced. Senator Worth, as Senate Majority Leader now, introduced the bill very early on in the process, so it was one of the highest priority pieces of legislation. and did incorporate almost everything that we put into the administrative rule. And it also incorporated some other pieces. So I'm going to go through just a few of the things that we were able to do with Senate Bill 3 that is now law in the state of New Mexico. As I mentioned earlier, we dealt with the unconstitutional aspects of our previous state law that had been found unconstitutional due to Citizens United. One of the things it did, and this was not something in my rule or something that I advocated for, but we used to have a 2-tier contribution limit system in New Mexico. If you were running for a statewide office, you were under a certain limit of, this year would have been $5,700. If you were running for a districted or lower level, say a county level office, it was $2,600. The legislature decided, you know what, that's like too confusing. We don't want to deal with all that. We're going to just make everything a $5,000 limit. It's interesting because we've gone through a weird history on this subject in New Mexico. Up until 2010, we had no limits. It was the Wild West out here. You could raise or spend as much money as you could or you wanted to. And then we went to this limit system following the 2010 election that had been in for almost 10 years. And then the legislature decided, you know what, we're going to make the limits a little bit, we're gonna raise them for some and lower it for others, but it's just 5,000, and then there's just no confusion anymore, right? They also doubled the limits for gubernatorial candidates. I'm not sure what the motivation is for that. You can all probably guess what the motivation for that is. But now gubernatorial candidates in New Mexico can raise up to $10,000. And mind you, these limits are per cycle. So per primary and per general. So I, as a statewide candidate, for my next election, I can raise $5,000 in the primary and $5,000 in the general from each contributor. A gubernatorial candidate can raise twice that for their campaign. One of the things that we did do is we fixed the notion of campaign cycles. It had been quite confusing in the past. And so we adjusted those time frames. And one of the things that we had dealt with was that we had sort of different time frames, different cycles applying to different individuals depending on which, point in their term they were in. So now we just have a primary and a general every 2 years. Everybody is working in those same terms. So that also reduces quite a bit of confusion. But those were all things that only the legislature could do. In addition to the limits in terms of contributions, there used to be a $50 cap per occurrence on the value of, there used to be a $50 cap on the occurrence of, or the instances of personal property. So if I, as a candidate, am using my home, as my campaign office, or if I'm using, say I'm an attorney and I have my legal office that I want to use for my campaign purposes. Used to be you could only use about $50 of that, which is sort of like an unrealistic, way to account for that. That cap was removed. One of the other things that we did is that we are now requiring that any campaign or political entity that registers with our office, if they're going to have a change in their campaign treasurer, and here in New Mexico, you can either appoint a campaign treasurer, or as a candidate, you can be your own treasurer. I'm not so much in love with the being your own treasurer piece, and I do personally believe and always advise candidates that every campaign should have an independent treasurer. It is helpful in a situation, say, where you had a treasurer and they resign on you abruptly, or, heaven forbid, become ill or pass away or something like that. But at least now we have this requirement that they have to notify us within 10 days if there's a change. Why is that important and why is that helpful? It goes to enforcement, and it goes to the voluntary compliance aspect of enforcement that my office is charged with. So if a campaign report is due and it doesn't get submitted on time, and it's running late, and a candidate or a committee is at risk of incurring fines, we want to be able to reach out and contact someone and say, hey, you need to get your report in so you don't start incurring fines. Because at the end of the day, we want the reports in. We want the reports in. We want people to see who's raised and spent what. that's really what it's all about, and that's why you have the stick of the $50 fine per day in place. So in a perfect world, we're not issuing any fines to anybody. People are just submitting their stuff. But obviously this happens. So now we have this requirement where we have to have that information so we can do that outreach in advance. We can make sure that folks are getting their stuff in. And I want to emphasize again this notion of voluntary compliance. There is a specific state statute that requires my office to, quote unquote, at all times seek voluntary compliance. So before I do anything else, before I leverage a fine, before I send something to a DA or a district attorney, my first and foremost goal is to get somebody to comply voluntarily, because again, the end goal is to get the information so that it can be made available to the public, because that's really the point at the end of the day, is to give the public a complete picture of what people are raising and spending in their campaigns, who is giving that money and how is it being spent by the campaigns. One of the new creations, if you will, that popped up in Senate Bill 3 was something else that didn't come from my office but came from the legislature. And it's this notion of the Legislative Caucus Committee. So in the New Mexico legislature, of course, we have two houses, the Senate and the House. In each house, we have a majority party and a minority party. With this new provision, the leadership of the party in each house, and depending on whether they're the majority or the minority, now gets to create what's called a caucus committee. And the purpose of the caucus committee is to, as you would imagine, help elect more members to that caucus in the upcoming election. So what they did is they carved out a space for themselves to raise 5 times the limits of contributions as any other campaign or PAC to be able to do this work. Tripp's laughing, I know. I feel you, buddy. Floor amendment. That's all I have to say. Floor amendment. I'm literally sitting there trying to get this bill passed, and here's this floor amendment. And so what they can do now is they can raise and spend money, and they can pass that money down. So caucus committee can raise 5 times, and I can give that money, I can spend that money down ballot to people who are running to become members of my caucus or to be reelected to members of my caucus. And I don't have, the same limits don't apply now. In other words, in the past, you might have a caucus PAC. It could raise and spend $5,000, it could raise $5,000 per individual. It could only spend up to that much per candidate, right? Now it can sort of raise and spend unlimited funds. And this applies to the parties as well, between the parties and their candidates. And in some senses, this is a good thing, because I think what happened with Citizens United was that parties sort of were no longer the financial powerhouses of politics, right? You know, it used to be sort of parties were the ones sort of paving the way for their candidates. And when Citizens United came around and you had the emergence of super PACs and these independent groups coming in and raising, spending money, you know, the power of the parties really diminished. And you could argue that's a good or a bad thing. I'm a parties person, just going way back to the founding, not that I was alive then, but in, in my study of how the whole party system came about. And to me, that's a much more accountable system than having all of these independent, unaccountable dark groups out there basically doing the same thing. But at the end of the day, now the parties have much more fluidity with regard to the money that they can raise and spend to help elect candidates up and down the ballot of their own party. They're not as tied into that, that limit as they used to be. So importantly, Senate Bill 3 again adopted a lot of the aspects of the administrative rule that we developed around independent expenditures or dark money. It defined an independent expenditure as an expenditure that is made by a person other than a candidate or campaign committee. So in other words, say I'm running for re-election for Secretary of State. I cannot start an independent expenditure for my own re-election, right? Because I am by definition not independent of my own campaign. It can't be a coordinated expenditure. So if you're raising and spending money to help elect somebody under the auspices of independent expenditures, I can't be working together with the candidate or the campaign. It's therefore coordinated and it falls under the limits specified in the Campaign Reporting Act. It's made to pay for an advertisement that expressly advocates the election or defeat of a candidate or question on the ballot, is susceptible to no other reasonable interpretation than as an appeal to vote for or against, or refers to a clearly identified candidate or ballot question and is published and disseminated to the relevant electorate within 30 days before the primary and 60 days before the general. All of those specific criteria are the specific criteria that we carved out based on Citizens United and the subsequent legal decisions that were the framework that we could work with, that was deemed to be constitutional. Furthermore, as mentioned before, it expanded reporting requirements for independent expenditure committees. So, say you are, let's say there's some guy running for president named Joe, and you want to have an independent, well, let's make it New Mexico specific. Some guy running for governor named Joe. You want to create an independent expenditure committee.
With the much talked about military aid. Yes.
Elect Joe. Interesting.
Several times today, you already
I think somebody needs to mute themselves. Was I getting that boring already?
Is everyone on the phone? Please mute yourselves. If you're calling in, if you could please mute yourselves, so that you're not getting no background noise, that would be super helpful. Thank you.
The fact that it was delayed to a country that is active.
All right. Stand by for technical difficulties. David Becker. I know David. I'm going to tease him relentlessly about this. Deserves it too. Now he can't even defend himself. Okay. So we just went through the definition of what we consider an independent expenditure in New Mexico. I was giving my example of advocating for Joe for governor. Within 3 days, yep, sure enough, I just got a text from him. He's so sorry, everybody. It's okay, David, we know. Within 3 days of making the expenditure. So I write the check to the radio station. I write the check for the ad in the newspaper. It must be reported if it's $1,000 in a non-statewide contest, if it's 1,000 or more, or if it's 3,000 or more in a statewide contest. So if you spend $2,999 trying to elect Joe, you don't need to report that. And some would argue that's an arbitrary number. Again, those are the numbers that we came to based on all of these legal decisions that we kind of had to use for guidance to carve out those constitutional requirements. It needs to be done within 24 hours of making the expenditure if the amount is $3,000 or more and made within 7 days before the election. So in that 30 or 60 day period, if you spend $3,000 or more, you have 3 days to report. If it's in the final last week of the election, you have to report it within 24 hours. And 3,000 or less than a sorry. I don't know what that bullet point was, so I'm going to skip that. Okay. So this is a lot to download, and I've really just touched on like the major changes. There were a lot of other things that were done with Senate Bill 3. For example, we clarified things like the disclosure statements on campaign ads, for example. That was another previously unconstitutional provision that we had to fix. And so now we have not only in statute, but in our new administrative rule following the passage of SB 3, what is required to be put on a printed t-shirt or what is required to be said verbally in an ad, right? These are all good things because, again, at the end of the day, they're all pro-disclosure, pro-accountability. There are a ton of other aspects of campaign finance law that I'd love to chat with you all about. In particular, you know, the emergence of the Ethics Commission that will be going to work starting on January 1st, what our role is going to be like with them, working together with them. But I think in the interest of time and wanting to make sure that I answer any questions you all may have, I'm going to leave it there for now. I do want to point out, in addition to the election code, which has the fresh updated Campaign Reporting Act in it, we also have this set of FAQs in regard to campaign finance law that we have available on our website now. I chastised Alex earlier for not actually bringing the hard copies with him, but I know you all know how to use a computer. So I'm sure you can find them on the website. And if you can't, I hope you all know you can get a hold of Alex, Alex Curtis, my communication director there in the background, if you need anything. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have. Yes, sir.
I recall looking at the campaign disclosure forms and seeing a lot of PDFs all over the thing, and it was really a pain. Have you converted to more of a digital in and digitally accessible format?
I'm so glad you brought that up. So one of the things I didn't mention is that coming soon to a computer near you, in April of this coming year, we are going to have our brand new campaign finance information system open for business. And those of you like me who for many years could rely only on OpenSecrets.org to get the information you needed will now be able to get so much more from our campaign finance information system. In addition to going away from the PDF reports, although that will still be an option for folks, it will be a lot more intuitive and user-friendly to do downloadable data, to look at things interactively. Things will be cross-referenced. It will be illustrative. For example, on our on the splash page, you'll be able to, as we've just had a report due, say, we'll be able to do graphics like, what were the top 10 contributors in the state of New Mexico, this last report, which candidates raised the most money, which industries, right, kind of in the way that OpenSecrets does, gave the most money. So it'll be digestible just from a sort of casual user standpoint, as well as much more intuitive and user-friendly from a researcher standpoint. I will say right now, although it is not easy to figure out, which is why we're fixing it, you can download the data now. We do make all of those reports available in a downloadable Excel file format. But again, unless you have spent hours and lost nights of sleep, I know Tripp's nodding, with our system, you wouldn't necessarily know you can do that. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about what the realities are of enforcing the anti-coordination provision?
Sure. The reality is that unless we receive some sort of credible evidence that coordination is occurring, there's very little we can do. Of course, as I'm sure you know, our office receives complaints about violations of the Campaign Reporting Act, and that can range anything from, somebody forgot to report a contributor to, something nefarious like coordinated activity that's not being reported. What we will do is we treat every single complaint that comes into the office the same way. We open an initial file. We reach out to the person or entity that's being complained about. We explain to them what the complaint is, and we send them what we call colloquially in our office a please explain yourself letter. We just ask them to tell us in their own words what the deal is with this complaint. And depending on the information we get, sometimes we are able to sort of continue that conversation. And a lot of times, particularly, well, let me say especially, when there is no actual misfeasance going on, we're able to resolve those issues fairly quickly and kind of, get the complaint resolved. The challenge when we have an entity that has been complained about for which either we do not get a response, or the response we get is insufficient, is that we can kind of continue down that path. But number one, my office is way understaffed and way underfunded. We currently do not have investigators in my office. We have compliance officers. And again, their main goal is that voluntary compliance piece. So we have very little in the way of actual tools within the office to do further research. Secondly, we don't have any power to subpoena. So I can ask for information all day long. I can ask for bank statements. And again, when folks are, you know, either genuinely made a mistake, made an error, want to get an issue resolved quickly, they will work with us and they'll provide us the information we ask for. But of course, we know that's not always the case. And so those are the situations that are really challenging, and where for now, our only options are to refer them either to the district attorney or the attorney general's office. Once they get referred over, I don't have any more control over them, and the Attorney General's office, of course, doesn't comment on those issues as they are being investigated. What I'm looking forward to with the emergence of the Ethics Commission is through a joint powers agreement that we are currently, that we are actually about to sign off on. We're going to be able to refer a lot of these matters, the civil matters in particular, to that Ethics Commission, which is going to have those powers. They will have the power of investigation, of subpoena, to be able to conduct hearings, to be able to gather evidence in a much more effective way than we currently have. And that's one of the conversations that we're having with the Ethics Commission right now, is that we're looking forward to that relationship where our office can take care of more of the sort of day-to-day, you know, banal, you forgot to file your report, your campaign treasurer went on vacation when the report was due, it's 5 days late, let's get that in, or you have $100 fine because you missed, you know, the deadline by 2 days, or what have you. But the Ethics Commission will be able to deal with those more complicated issues that, you know, it's funny, in a nutshell, the legislature gave this office the power of enforcement, but gave us no tools to do real enforcement, and that's the rub. Including funding, which we're asking for a lot more of this year. That's a whole other conversation too. What else? I'm in the room with a bunch of reporters and no one wants to ask me more questions.
What was the development of the rulings for limits on the gubernatorial spending being higher? Is it the profile? I mean, you run a statewide race, et cetera, et cetera.
To be honest with you, I wasn't in those conversations. I'm assuming, don't want to make assumptions. I think that's correct. I think, you know, if you look at statewide races, so like mine in the last cycle I raised like $420,000, raised and spent $420,000. That's a lot for Secretary of State's race, right? The Attorney General, I think, raised and spent around $1 million in his last campaign. And of course, we know the governor raised and spent, what was it, 8 million on 6 to 8 million. I should know this off the top of my head. I'm embarrassed that I don't. Right, so obviously there is the higher profile, you know, much like a presidential campaign, right? There's a lot more places to travel, a lot more things to do. But in essence, I'm not really sure what the specific reason was, maybe other than that it's a higher profile race. Yes, ma'am.
So is the Caucus Committee, like, is it considering itself a political action committee, or how would you find it on CFIS? Like, where would it be filing its reports?
So yeah, it would be under political action committee. Mm-hmm. And Alex, that's an interesting flag maybe for the future. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
No, I was just gonna say that they, you know, we have all, I don't know if you mentioned that, but all 4 have registered now. Some of which just switched the names of existing committees. So if you go on CFIS, like I think it's called like the Bryner Golf Speaker Fund or something for the Democratic House. And if you search that, it'll come up on CFIS. We could get you the names of the other ones. They're not, some of the, like I think the Republican Senate one is like PAC 22 or something, right. Like something that it wouldn't you know, but yeah, they are all on there and they're searchable in that way.
And I think what I was just going to say as a flag for us as we're developing new CFIS is maybe we create a separate category for the caucus committees so that people know what those are. Yeah. we're good.
To kind of read back what you're saying about independent expenditure groups, and we won't see anything until May, right? 30 days before the...
Right. Well, yes and no. If you're just a independent, you exist only for the purpose of getting involved in this race, Joe for governor, for example, and you start to get involved, you're right. You're not going to see anything reported as a purely independent expenditure until May. However, if you're making independent expenditures out of an already existing PAC that's registered with our office, you would see those starting with the April reports. But even then, you know, that's fairly late in the year. Did that make sense? Or did...
Why don't we ask if there's any online users who have
Oh, online users, do you have questions?
Feel free to send them to us either by Zoom or I guess tweets or whatever method is easiest for you.
Zoom or tweets or whatever method is easiest for you.
You'll need to unmute yourself to ask the question. I think we're okay. Last call for online.
Last call for online questions. For me. Are we good? All right. Well, I'll just end by saying, as I hope you all know, we really strive to be an open and transparent office. I would not say we are perfect because nobody is, but we really do our best with this in mind, that knowing that having this information is a really powerful tool for the public to be able to make these important decisions about who they elect and how they vote. That is our deep commitment, and to the extent that we are doing it well, I'm really proud of that. To the extent we could be doing it better, we want that feedback. Our attitude in the office is we're not made of glass. We can take constructive feedback and work with it and work to make things better, and that is our commitment to all of you. And I want to thank you all again, particularly the press in the room, for what you all do and for working together in partnership with us to get that information out. Did we get something? No? Okay. We're good. Okay, with that, thank you all so much. It was nice to be with you today.
Thank you all again. Next up, we have New Mexico in depth. We are really excited to have
Marjorie here with us today, talking about some of their developments and work. Thank you so much for coming.
And is this just on? Is it on? Yeah, and actually anyone can chime in. Thank you to the folks from Center for Responsive Politics for including us in this presentation. I'm only going to talk for a few minutes, and really when we were thinking about like what we might contribute to this conversation, we were thinking, well, let's just kind of like throw out some of our challenges as an organization that has done campaign finance reporting since we started almost. Let's just throw out some of the kind of lessons we've learned and challenges that we face in doing this work as a way to kind of get people's juices flowing a little bit for the conversation with OpenSecrets. And I have some notes because I get all over the place. So why do we do this work? Well, for us, obviously, you know, we're old political heads who think accountability journalism when it comes to money and politics is super important. It's really important for us to be looking at the reports, be scrutinizing how much money flows through the system. But we also think transparency is important. Transparency, we think the public ought to be able to go to the website and find the information they need without us, which is one reason why we actually kind of, in some ways, we focus in on little transparency issues sometimes that may seem small, but we think are super important for the public, and to actually make the point to the legislature in particular that transparency is something they ought to be championing. So tracking money, and by extension the special interest that money represents, is a challenging task in this state. There's a couple of like kind of particular points we would make. to start with, there's just data that's not required to be reported, that ought to be required. And that is not rocket science, because it's required in other states around the country. It's not like we are advocating for there to be some kind of new like invention in the state. We need more data to be required reporting. We also think we need better technology to track the data. And hey, you know, shout out to the Secretary of State as she leaves. Really, we cannot wait for the new campaign finance information system that rolls out in April. We think it's going to be it's going to take our work above and beyond where we're able to go now. We hope it's going to be along the lines of the FEC website, you know, where you can really do some really deep dive on data. So we're really looking forward to that. And we also want to touch on a little bit on timeliness of reporting, and we think that there could be, we think that we ought to be able to get data in real time, not just periodic reports that are due. Anyway, so I'm going to throw out some examples that I think would be really beneficial. And then if other people have any, I'd like to hear them. I'd like to hear what other people's challenges are. One, we think that races that PACs spend money on, or the content of the targeting that they do in geographies or races, we think they ought to report that, rather than just list a bunch of expenditures for like media companies. We think that actually in the reports we ought to be able to find what races PACs are actually targeting. We think the amount of money paid to lobbyists just to do the work by their employers, or specific legislation that lobbyists are working to advance, ought to be reported. And of course, those lobbyists and their employers are also making campaign contributions. And while it may seem like a small thing, we think it's really important for the state to require reporting on the employer of campaign contributors. In Albuquerque, they require this. In Albuquerque, when you go and you search campaign contribution reports, you can see who the employer of a contributor is, and it allows you to actually go beyond an individual reporter and see how much money a company is giving through its employees. And it can actually raise all kinds of questions around bundling, to get around the rules, I mean, or just, it helps you actually do industry analysis in a much deeper way to really understand the special interests behind these campaign contributions. So we think the state ought to require the reporting of employer information. That's a big one for us. So those are just a couple of examples of data we think ought to be collected. Maggie really spoke a lot about SB3. I was going to say a lot more about it than I have to now. I think it's a huge win for transparency to require nonprofit organizations that don't have to register as PACs to actually now have to file a report with the state. However, there were those campaign contribution limits that she mentioned. And I just want to like say, you know, for us, this is like this constant changing landscape around how we track dark money in New Mexico. So think about that bill for a second. My understanding is that it actually got rid of campaign contribution limits on these legislative caucuses for in-kind donations to candidates. So she said contributions in general, and I'm not sure, I think it's in-kind contributions. But think about what you're going to see in campaign reports. You're going to see a legislative caucus committee that has brought in a ton of donations, really big ones, and then you're going to see a lot of in-kind contributions to candidates, possibly a lot of in-kind contributions from a caucus committee. Then you're going to see big payments just to a media company. And there's not going to be any like earmarking in there or real details around how they targeted that money or the interests of the people who gave to the caucus. Maybe someone said to like say Brian Egoff, for example, hey, I will give you $25,000, but only if you like use it in these races. We won't know that. So how are we going to know that? So we have this constant shifting like struggle to actually understand how money is being spent to influence races in New Mexico. And this new law, while on the independent expenditure side is great, on this side, when it comes to these in-kind contributions and all this like stuff now that these committees can like raise, I think it's going to cause us a lot of heartburn in 2020. Just in terms of tracking it and being able to understand what that money's about. So I think that's really something for all of us to pay attention to, those of us who do this kind of reporting. And then of course, complicating our work on that landscape, particularly for the independent expenditure organizations, the nonprofits that don't register as PACs. It's just the social media environment. I mean, being able to track the political advertisements on Facebook and Twitter and on Google is very difficult. So yeah, you can do your searches, but how you actually track groups that are doing political advertising is difficult. And in fact, I mean, I've just had to throw my hands up a few times because I don't even know what a particular group is. They don't show up anywhere in the reports. You know, you don't know who they are. So, I mean, as political reporters who track campaign finance, that is a wild world. Okay, so moving on to, and I really think that the work that the OpenSecrets folks are doing in particular in this area is going to be really beneficial to us, and I'm looking forward to like really digging in on it. So just a few more things. I think accessing the data. So Maggie, you know, she said they're rolling out the new system. It's great. Right now, it's really bad. To me, it's just really bad. You know, I mean, the Secretary of State's office has always been super responsive to us, and we've like pointed out that there's information that's supposed to be collected and they're not collecting it. And then they go and collect it. But an example of this on their CFIS system right now, there's the data download, but you can't, the employer reports are not in that. They're just PDFs. The independent expenditure reports right now aren't in that. They're just over in this separate site. So hopefully this new system brings it all together. And I believe them. I think it's going to be robust, and I'm looking forward to it. And we will hopefully be able to archive our, we've been doing this for a while. We put in public information requests and get all of their data sets, and we upload them into our own web app called the Openness Project, and that actually can do some of the things that she described. But it's a lot of our time and our resources to do that. And we're actually thinking, if this site is as good as they say it's going to be, maybe we can archive it and just do some more cool stuff. So then finally, I'll just close because I think we want to get into OpenSecrets. For us, timeliness is a huge struggle in the state. And, you know, there's a reporting schedule. All of this is in statute. It would have to be changed before we could change anything. But there is really, from our perspective, real-time reporting or very close to that, reporting of campaign contributions and political expenditures, including the content, medium, geographic and demographic targeting of an ad that can be seen immediately through a real-time campaign finance system would be super beneficial. And some may think this is pie in the sky, but with today's technological environment, it actually should not be that difficult. I mean, it shouldn't be that difficult to do it. In the absence of real-time reporting, candidates and PACs can manipulate the system. So they can, there's rules, right? So here's an example of what they can do, which they can run an ad and wait to wait to pay the invoice to the media company that produced it and bought the airtime and then ran it. They can wait to invoice it till the day after the reports are due. And this ad can be out in the world. They can create their PAC with some generic names. They can then go buy an ad that is attacking somebody, saying all kinds of false things. They can run the ad and then wait to pay their invoice to the media company so the day after the report is due. And then you have the whole next reporting cycle where the public doesn't know who's behind it. So we think that real-time reporting would go a long way towards greater transparency in the campaign finance world for the public. Because, you know, the public gets up in arms about they are paying attention. And when they see these really nasty ads they're bombarded by, they want, short of just being able to access the data themselves, they want journalists to tell them who's doing it. And we can't get that information without a lot of shoe leather journalism. So is there anything other folks here would add to like challenges?
Just curious. So would broadcasters get the, receive the ad and the payment for the ad? Under FCC requirements, they post immediately to a public file, correct? So that's somewhat real time, isn't it, for over-the-air purchases?
Yeah, that's true.
Does anything similar exist for social media platforms?
Am I right about that? Have things changed?
There's no government requirement.
No.
Platforms have kind of approached that on an ad hoc basis. There's some data that's available on a real-time basis, but it really varies by platform, and it varies based on the win of the platform, of whether or not they're keeping it and how much information they provide. We're going to go into that a bit in the presentation to what is available, but it's not something that's required across the board. On the federal level, to some extent, with ads that do use the vote for, vote against language, there are some requirements, but the vast majority just aren't covered by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly with social media, I think it's really difficult to track. And I mean, these ads, a lot of these ads these days, a lot of these kind of video ads aren't being aired. There's a lot of them floating around social media. And they're very like, they're mysterious. I mean, people don't know who's running them, so.
Additionally, even if the ad is disclosed as to who's paying for it, you don't necessarily know until, if the group is even registered with the Campaign Finance Oversight Committee, you don't know who's funding that group. So until you get those reports, which aren't filed at real time anywhere.
So yeah, real-time reporting. And then, in addition, just this open data, having just an open data mindset where, where we can pull data. This is where you start getting really wonky, but it's really important to be able to pull data from the Secretary of State's website into some app you've created, so that you're not constantly having to file an IPA request, it takes us about 6 weeks to update our app because we have to file an IPA to get the data sets. And I think having more of an open data approach would be beneficial in the state, where not just for campaign finance, across the board, all the data sets that are collected, having the ability just to, connect to that data through a feed would be super beneficial. So it's getting a little wonky, but that's on our wish list. Okay, that's all we had, unless other people have any challenges they want to throw out there.
Mark, what's the state's, is it occupation instead of employer?
It's occupation.
Okay. Say you require employer and you're like a real estate agent, right? And you don't actually have an employer, or you're a consultant, but not technically a lobbyist. Have you seen effective ways of addressing that, or would just saying employer?
Well, the city, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I'm pretty sure the city requires both occupation and employer. I'm not saying get rid of occupation. They should add employer. Okay. Because it allows you, the occupation allows you to, we've done some really, we're kind of like nerdy about stuff like this. We're like kind of into industry type analysis. And so we've been able to use the occupation column to really go through and analyze that column and then sort people and try to come up with industries.
Yeah. To
really then look at kind of the big, what is an industry spending? So I'm not saying that the occupation column is completely useless, but the employer column combined with that would really make it much easier to kind of understand. And then, of course, the employer column also lets you know things like companies, like bigger companies, are they like, I'm not saying they're doing this on purpose, but there's this whole bundling thing that it's against the law, but if you see some companies that are, all their employees are giving the same amount of money, it's like, well, is there some kind of bundling happening there? It's just a question you can ask And the other kind of interesting thing we've been able to do with employer, because it's, because if you're the owner, then you would just put the company, you know, and so then you can see companies that are under the umbrella of one big company, and you can start seeing how much maybe one owner of one big umbrella company has cranked into one candidate's campaigns, limited by campaign contributions, but going through every single company. That's been something we've been able to do in Albuquerque that we can't do at the state level that well.
Are there good states that do that? You know, that you can think of?
I'm not familiar with state level campaign finance very many places, although I do know that Illinois, where I live, does require employer and occupation. But at the federal level, they do both. And I look at that data all the time. And if a person is self-employed as a consultant, they'll just say consultant self. And that's what we have to work with. So it's not perfect, but it gets some of the way.
At the risk of frustrating people who've known me a long time, in 2002, in Connecticut, they had an employer, they had a governor who was under investigation, and the analysis that you were able to do on an employer was pretty amazing, sure. And I know Illinois, Massachusetts, I think has an employer. California, I think has an employer. So just that single, like the more data points you're able to do, the better analysis you're able to make. And so employer is one of those things where you can actually start talking about bundling and stuff.
One place that has resources on what is disclosed.
Thank you so much. One place that does have resources about what is disclosed to some extent on a state-by-state level would be followthemoney.org, the Center for Money and Politics. I know they do an annual, or at least every few years, they do a pretty comprehensive study on what each state discloses, the level of disclosure, where those data points can be found. They also provide a pretty good composite database of all the different states, similar to what OpenSecrets does with data at the federal level. And so that might be a good resource to check if you're trying to figure out what's disclosed by state and seeing kind of a good model for that. I guess with that, we can kind of work our way into OpenSecrets presentation. We're going to kick off with OpenSecrets Research Director, or Director of Research and Strategy, Sarah Bryner, who will be up here to talk kind of about an overview of the site. I assume you wanted to kick us off?
We are scheduled for a break. Do people want to just keep going so that there's more time for Q&A, or would people like a formal break? Keep going? Nodding? Okay, I see nodding for keep going, which works for me. And please, people have already been doing this, but take advantage of the cookies and the coffee whenever you need to. I'm going to try to share the screen. One moment.
Is everyone able to see all right who is in here? I know we've had a couple complaints about the lights from online folks.
Okay, I am sharing our screen. That should solve that problem. Okay, that doesn't look like that's, I can't tell if it's sharing. Online people, can you let me know if you can see the screen or if you can see the room?
Yes.
They can see the screen. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Sarah Bryner. I'm the research director at OpenSecrets. I actually do live in Chicago, which is a whole nother bag of political worms that we won't talk about today. It was interesting to hear Secretary Oliver's comments about the gubernatorial race costing $8 million when we had a $100 million contest of billionaires in 2018. It was terrible. So just to get started, my role here is as the supporting cast to Anna's more New Mexico specific presentation. So I'm going to be going through some of our kind of higher level offerings about presidential candidates, and then some of our new data on online ads, which we have just released to OpenSecrets, so it is very fresh. And then as well as our New Mexico view of the campaign finance data. And then Anna will jump into our awesome New Mexico platform, which has a lot more of the of the digital advertising information as well as curated New Mexico specific data. And then hopefully we can get some good conversations going at the end. So I'm going to pick on Donald Trump's presidential profile, not because he's particularly relevant to what we're talking about, but because he has a lot of data and his profile can show a lot of what the OpenSecrets database is capable of. So I'm just going to use this. We're going to roll out some of the tools here to other races and places on the site over the course of the cycle, but the presidential section is the most up to date right now. So, you know, for those people who are familiar with OpenSecrets, we have been showing fundraising information for the candidates for a long time. In the post-Citizens United era, we've started adding information about the super PACs sort of supporting cast to the presidential contests, which include super PACs devoted entirely to supporting one political candidate. This used to be somewhat of an anomaly, but more recently, every high-profile candidate, every presidential candidate in recent history has had a super PAC supporting him or her alone. And there are a lot of the Democratic candidates right now who have sort of disavowed this concept and said that they will not support a super PAC supporting them, but we'll see how long that lasts into the general election. So you can see the fundraising totals here. We go into a lot of detail about how the money is, from whom the money is raised. And President Trump's fundraising is a little bit tricky because he gets a lot of his support through a different committee, a joint fundraising committee, who raises money for him and the Republican National Committee. So that complicates things. This is why if you're ever looking at these numbers, they won't match what the FEC displays, because we estimate the amount of money from small donors via sort of itemized level data. Very wonky, won't get too much into that, but if you're ever looking at the site and thinking, why doesn't that match the FEC, that's why we do some value add there. You can see from which regions the money comes, sort of the top states. New Mexico's probably, unfortunately, not on very many of these lists, or maybe fortunately. In the case of many national Republicans, Texas is always near the top, Florida. The areas that are supporting him, and in this case his super PACs, Las Vegas, Nevada, and then the zip codes. So we go down into quite a level of detail, and I think that can be really helpful for reporters who want to know really, where this money is coming from. As Tripp mentioned and Marjorie mentioned, we do a lot of industry analysis. We use that occupation and employer information to assign industry information to specific donations. That is a lot of work, but I think it really can help get to the bottom of who's funding these candidates. In the case of Trump, retired, you can see, he actually has, surprisingly perhaps, I think based on his reputation, a pretty grassroots fundraising base. And you can see that here, a lot of the biggest industry, even including the super PACs that support him, are retirees who aren't employed elsewhere. So I think that's interesting. I think people might have the impression that, Wall Street or oil, which are both big donors to him, are big sort of fundraising his campaign. But, when you look at the data, that isn't what we necessarily see borne out. So this can be, I think, helpful for clarifying assumptions and expectations. We also aggregate at the donor level. That also is a lot of work. And if I were advising a state into making truthful disclosure, I would say assign donor IDs and disclose them, or standardize donor name, because we do that work and it is impossible. You'll be looking at millions of Bob Roberts Jr., Bob Roberts who's retired from New York. We really have no idea who that donor is, even if they're disclosing in full accordance with the law. And that can have some surprising implications when we're looking at this information. So we do assign donor IDs, but they're not perfect. And we're sort of always tinkering with our algorithm. In this case, we also standardize employer name. I would also recommend that a system do that for us, but I'm not a policy person. So you can see the major donors by employer. Again, this is sort of interesting. These are donors to the super PACs and his presidential campaign, but as we know, donations to campaigns are limited, super PACs are not. So usually the top contributors reflect only the donors to the super PACs. So you can kind of look around and see who some of these companies are. So sort of most excitingly, we put this up last Thursday. And this is data from the Google Transparency Ad Platform. And you can scroll down. Google, as well as Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, have probably, in a desire not to have this be a law enforced upon them, have started releasing online ad data to the public. Now, Facebook's data is a sort of hornet's nest of difficulties. Google's data, thankfully, is a lot more straightforward and easy to work with. Unfortunately, there's a lot less money there. So we were able to get the Google data up, and you can see here the total spending since they released the information, which was in 2018, and the total spending by single candidate pro-Trump groups just on online Google ads. So $12 million is quite a lot for this point in the cycle. You can see this by date. It peaked in late September. So you can kind of see, oh, if you're writing a story, how did the impeachment hearings, for example, affect Trump's online ad spending? You can see sort of how specific events lead to changes in the campaign's advertisements. You can see which committees are spending the most. I'm so sorry, I didn't know this was blocking that. Hold on. There you go. You can see that the Trump political campaign is spending the most, but actually no, his joint fundraising committee is spending the most, but his presidential campaign has spent $3.7 million so far. These are all small numbers. They're gonna get significantly larger over time. And then most excitingly to me at this point, you can actually see the advertisements. This ad is the most recent, I can't show it to you on this, hold on. It's just too exciting not to share the ads. I'm such an ad geek. And it is so exciting to get access to something we've been asking for forever. So this is actually a video, I'm not sure that'll work. Oh, ad blocker. No, I know why I'm not in Firefox. Firefox doesn't have the ad blocker. That's how we get around things. So yeah, you can actually see.
This impeachment is a charade. Just 10 days after President Trump was inaugurated, the whistleblower's lawyer Mark Zaid wrote that the coup has started and impeachment will follow. That's right. The whistleblower's own lawyer wrote the coup has started and impeachment will follow. They promised.
Yeah, you don't need to see the whole thing. So you can actually watch the ads. You can see the images. It's really exciting and a really new development in the political reporting universe, I think. We only show this information right now, and we only show it for presidential candidates. We're going to be building it out, and I'd actually love to hear from you guys what you think would be helpful. But Google provides targeting data, and this is actually one of the most exciting things for me. I pulled up just looking at the data yesterday, and this is not a particularly inspiring graphic, but just a list of all of the groups that have identified that they're targeting the state of New Mexico. So you can see all of these campaigns, national level, some that you'd expect, some that might be sort of new names. Tammy Baldwin. So this is one way to look at this. Yeah?
Steve Bullock is the former governor of Montana.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, he's running for president. So these are organizations that are, well, there's Maggie, it's our friend, who are targeting the state of New Mexico in data that you can't see here, but that's in the Google disclosed ad data, which you can just download here if you go to, and Anna, I don't know if Anna is going to talk about this. Oh. Yeah, on transparencyreport.google.com, you can download the data as a CSV. There's 6 files. They link up nicely. The data's a little bit messy because it's only it's dependent on the dedication of the advertiser, how detailed they'll be. And I only looked at organizations targeting New Mexico who said that by name, but a lot of campaigns target specific zip codes. So one of the things we want to do is develop a system so that people can see who's targeting their state and also any zip codes in their state. They also provide targeting information on demographics. So who's targeting men, women, they provide exclusion data. I didn't know that campaigns could do this, but you can tell Google, I don't want this ad to run in New Mexico. The one I looked at for that was an ad from Susan Collins, who didn't want the ad to run in Maine. So why a campaign would not want an ad to run in their own state is interesting. So that's, I think, actually has to do with fundraising. And you can get all of this information through the Google Transparency platform. We also have received support from some funders to do a lot of work with this data and build out an entire platform over the next few months. So we'll be adding a lot of this information to OpenSecrets, which is exciting. I'm sure there'll be lots more questions about the Google data. I don't know. Does anyone have anything on this so far? Okay. Yeah?
Well, it's not crucial, but
it's okay.
They started providing this at the same time they announced these kind of parameters about how they're going to allow people to drill down on political ads, just men, women.
I don't know Google's own requirements for disclosure. I just know what they disclose to us or to the public.
Google's requirements have changed a lot and continue changing after they put their ads available on the platform. These are available as of like last June, later June, I believe.
Yeah.
Roughly around those dates, but they continue changing their policies on what needs to be disclosed. We did have some changes before them as well.
And it's not going to be stable. Twitter just announced they're not even allowing political ads, although I've seen a lot of promoted ads from politicians still on Twitter. Yeah. Oh, well, that would be why. So that's, who knows? This is the problem with platform enforcement of platform disclosure. You don't know how they're going to change things going forward. Yeah?
On OpenSecrets, how often is the Google Ads that you have updated?
Every week, and that's as often as we think Google updates it. But we've seen their file changing off days that it shouldn't be changing. So, but right now it's so beta. We're hoping to develop more of a push system where when the ad information comes in, we look at it. What I'm really excited about is being able to identify groups that haven't appeared in the federal data that we work with elsewhere. Because this is a place where that might happen. And one important thing I didn't even mention, these are political advertisements. We have no real idea how Google or anyone defines what is or is not political. that's a problem. Certainly they do in many cases mention candidates. Everyone I've looked at has been political. One of the ones targeting New Mexico that I pulled up in advance of this is this, funded by Priorities USA. So everything looks political. Most of them that I've seen have mentioned candidates by name. So that might be how Google's defining it.
They don't supply methodology on.
They do to some extent.
They do, a little bit.
Something that's very much in flux and ill-defined. Google has provided some information on how they do incorporate some issue advertisers that vary to some extent regionally, by country as well as to some extent by state even, based on requirements of the states. Generally, Google is more just political, but they have some issue ads. It's more, but that's more ad hoc, and there really isn't a very clear definition of which issue ads are included and which aren't in the case of Google. Other platforms also have different requirements of which ads they include and which they don't. We'll get into that a bit more later about what those specific things you can find on each platform are, but it really is extremely ill-defined.
Yeah, the best and only place for this is on the Transparency Report Help Center. They have a list of FAQs.
Ask one of the questions.
Sure, of course.
Get back, if we get back into the joint committee versus the committee on the president.
Sure.
Well, what was reflected under the joint committee, was that just the president's take, or was that also the party's take?
For that's the amount the Joint Fundraising Committee spent on Google Ads. Unknown whether they targeted the president or the RNC. That's just how much they spent.
Okay, so I'm probably thinking about expenditure.
You're thinking of, of fundraising.
You have to be careful about how much they. Okay.
Yes, you do. The Joint Fundraising Committee will give money to the presidential campaign and to the party and to other candidates potentially, but that's a different can of worms. Yeah. Just to jump over, and I'm hesitant to even do this, I did want to flag our Get Local section, which allows you to see money at the federal level specific to New Mexico. Here is a good resource for top-line information about who's receiving money, Democrats, Republicans, how much they're receiving, how much the parties are getting, who the candidates are in these races. We identify some of them as sort of hot races. And so you can, it's a very competitive third, or very open, a lot of candidates in that District 3 race. I don't even, Valerie Plame, okay. I should have looked at that beforehand. And then who the top donors are from the state. So Lobo PAC, University of New Mexico, obviously employs many professors who are giving to candidates. Sometimes there's nothing, much to say about some of these, and sometimes there is. The U.S. Department of Energy. To people who live here, some of these names are probably very, very familiar. What I think is interesting is when a name pops up that isn't familiar. Who is this? What are they doing? Why are they getting involved in our races? Go ahead. You got a question. Okay. You can see the top industries from the state. From my home state of Alaska, it's always oil and gas, but yeah. And then I think this is interesting, sort of the top regions, top zip codes that are giving to candidates. And then one of my favorite pages, which presidential candidates are receiving the most amount of money from New Mexico voters, which can be really interesting when you're dealing with primaries in primary season. Bernie Sanders, personally, I always like to think of things in proportion. Bernie Sanders has fundraised a lot of money, so the fact that he's getting the most from New Mexico donors doesn't necessarily mean that he's the favorite here. I don't actually know. But it can be interesting to see who does well, who does poorly. He's outraising Trump here. That's interesting. and so is Elizabeth Warren. So this is all available on OpenSecrets, and I hope that you get a chance to look at it in the next couple months. Okay, any other questions before I hand this over to Anna? And these are fluid presentations, so. Great. Oh, okay, yes.
So one thing that comes up when a lot recently when I'm looking at federal campaign finance, maybe this isn't a question.
Yes, okay.
Act Blue.
Yes.
And this has come up, like you were looking at Valerie Plame and all the money she's raised, where it's like I don't know where to get the Act Blue filing to decipher who's giving to her from where.
Yeah.
All these little donations.
Yeah, so the question's about Act Blue. This might get a little bit into the weeds. So in the last 4 years, the FEC has, we and the FEC both have converted to using the electronic files provided by the campaigns. This is significant because those electronic files contain much more data than do the audited files that the FEC maintains and processes and evaluates. That means that's great for us because we see more information. Also, it's not as great because we have to do a lot of that processing internally ourselves. Deduping is a big component of that. Act Blue, as a political action committee, functions. If you donate online to a Democratic candidate running for office, you are likely actually donating to Act Blue, who then gives the donation to the candidate. That means that that transaction is recorded twice by Act Blue and then once by the candidate committee. Which is a lot of data and can result very easily in triplication of a donation. Thankfully, those contributions are identified. So when we're showing this, you can see all of the donations going through Act Blue, but you won't be able to see sort of what is going through Act Blue and what isn't, and what is going to Act Blue specifically. That's harder to pull out. We think the most important relationship is the donor to the candidate, and that's kind of the information of those that are filed that we keep. Keep and display. But it's really important to be aware of Act Blue because it will inflate a lot of these itemized donation totals to Democrats vis-a-vis Republicans who don't have an Act Blue providing that information. Anytime you see these statewide totals, the industry totals, the geography totals, you're looking at small donations under $200 because Act Blue discloses them, so we take them, for Democrats. But you can't see them for Republicans because Republicans don't have an Act Red that does much. Does that make sense at all?
And the threshold for Republicans where there's
$200. Yeah.
That, you know.
Under that, we don't know. Yeah. You now can see donations that are made in smaller denominations than $200. If you make $50 donations 4 times, we'll start to see those in the FEC data, but that's new. And that's still only from people who have met that $200 threshold. Yes.
Can I ask a question on the, you mentioned triplication. I'm just
Yes.
wondering about the reporter on the back end trying to count money.
Mm-hmm.
Should reporters actually be very careful and know that there might be money counted 2 or 3 times, therefore it might not be $600, it could be only $200 or whatever. Is that something that we should be careful
Yes, yes. In the FEC data, look for the memo code. If you're looking at the campaign filing, look at the memo codes and get rid of the ones that different campaigns do it differently, but get rid of the one that says Act Blue. It's made, just ignore it. Yeah.
We just get rid of the Act Blue or PAC.
Yeah, good. That's what you should do.
In the Secretary of State, the PAC download, just get rid of Act Blue.
Because you can count it twice.
Because if you just count like the bottom line, if you go, oh, let's see from this reporting cycle, and just look at bottom line candidates, bottom line PACs, the PACs will be inflated.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of that money is also being reported by the candidate.
Yeah, it gets really hairy when a candidate donates, when a donor donates to something like Emily's List through Act Blue. and then Emily's list distributes the donation to the candidate. Welcome to my life. So it can be very, it's great. It's great. We love being able to see this data for the first time, but it's dangerous. Yes.
Emily's list in that scenario would record the donation from ActBlue.
Yes. Yeah.
If you can just get rid of ActBlue, then you're
Usually that should be what you need to do. And ActBlue thankfully doesn't actually give very many donations to candidates. I think they have given a few, which is why they have to be registered as a PAC. I have, not to call out any reporters, and I actually don't remember who this was, but I did see a story saying that Marianne Williamson got almost all of her money from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which if you know the ActBlue data, you know that that's the address for ActBlue. And it was definitely a moment where I appreciated how complicated some of this data can be for people who aren't familiar with it. And if you're using any data on OpenSecrets and it doesn't make sense, please call us. We are happy to help anytime about any question, regardless of how insignificant it might seem. We would rather, sometimes that helps us identify issues that we are not even aware of in our data. So just be mindful of that. Okay, anything else? That was a good little ActBlue rabbit hole. I appreciate any opportunity to talk about ActBlue and its headaches that it causes me. Although we do love the new data. Okay, Anna?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to present a bit more about our New Mexico specific data, as well as the tools that we built into OpenSecrets New Mexico Dark Money portal. It has a variety of different things, ranging from the more traditional campaign finance data you'll see here, as well as some links to political ad and digital ad information. And I'm going to pull that up. All right, so some of you might be familiar with the dark money section of our site. That's what you should see up here. It has a variety of different resources about just the basics of dark money, going over how to track it, who the top groups are spending in elections, that type of thing. At the bottom of the page, we've built out a specific portal for New Mexico data, where it describes a bit about the key resources that you might need to track politically active nonprofits and other groups in New Mexico that might not show up in our other data or might only have limited information in our other data. The beginning just kind of provides a bit of an introduction about why it's so important to track data at the state level as well as the federal level, since in many cases big federal groups might trickle down and start trying to impact states from outside of New Mexico, as well as some other groups that might not show up on the federal radar might show up in New Mexico. We've created a bit of a guide integrating a variety of different types of resources that are available for different states, but in particular in this case for New Mexico. This is a map that we've created looking at the different tools that are available. So starting at the top left, we have the Federal Election Commission. This is the federal campaign finance enforcement agency. They provide all the records that I'm sure a lot of y'all are familiar with. And they have things like financial information, to some extent the firms that are being paid by different campaigns and groups, people, some contact information. But one of the big caveats there is that this is only for spending on federal races, and that this is only groups that are actually registered as either political committees or that disclose that their activities are political. One of the big ways to get around that for groups like 501c4s that are not required to disclose their donors is that they call themselves not political groups. They say that they exist for the promotion of social welfare or for some other purpose. They're able to run things that they consider to be educational ads or issue ads. And in many cases, those ads might appear to the average voter to be political, but they're not disclosed as such. And because of that, a number of different groups can run ads painting a candidate in a very favorable light, saying how great they are, how terrible they are.
But as long as they don't use words like vote for, vote against, or run ads within a very short window before federal elections, they're able to, in many cases, operate without a paper trail that would show up in those filings. But if they do show up, those are the filings that you would want to get. In the state of New Mexico, we're really lucky enough to have a Secretary of State's office that does disclose things. As much as there are limitations there are some states with even less disclosure and very few filings. So we do have the various records from the Secretary of State's office of the campaign finance reports. You also have things like incorporation documents for groups that are incorporated in New Mexico. One caveat there that is in many cases dark money groups like 501c4s, limited liability companies or LLCs that are operating with the intent of hiding who is ultimately bankrolling them or who is behind them may not decide to incorporate in the state that they're targeting. They may incorporate in places like Delaware where disclosure is very limited and they're able to pay some type of middleman to act as their agent and can, in many cases, not even have to put the address that the organization is based out of. So even though it does provide incorporation records for there, it's usually worth checking Delaware as well, or checking a resource like OpenSecrets, which compiles incorporation records from a variety of different states. They're not affiliated with OpenSecrets, but they're a really good resource since you're able to, in many cases, search the name of an organization if you don't know where they're located or know where they're incorporated, and see where their incorporation records are and link to that. There is a little bit of lag between when incorporation records go to the states and when they show up there, but generally it's updated pretty quickly. And I don't have like a timeline for when it gets updated, but usually I've seen it within the week or so of when incorporation records go to the states. You also have charitable and nonprofit registration filings at the state level here. In many cases, this can provide information from groups that do say they operate for educational purposes or social welfare purposes, if they are still potentially operating and like running politicized ads, I guess, or what are effectively look like political ads. And there's a variety of other states that also have those. So if you do find that an organization is based in another state and targeting New Mexico with ads, nonprofit and charitable registration filings in various states can be fruitful. In some cases, you can get tax returns from these documents before you'll get them from the organizations themselves. There's a variety of other financial records that are required to be on file. And so those can be a really useful resource too. You also have the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level. This, there are a variety of different varying tax record requirements, whether it be registration or filing annual returns for groups like 501c4s and 501c3s that can engage in varying levels of political activity. 501c3 nonprofits are technically barred from being political entities, but they can run ads on things like voter registration and get out the vote. This becomes increasingly complicated as we've entered into a digital age. Whereas traditionally the content of ads themselves on TV and radio was what you would look for the political nature. Now, even groups like 501c3s can run ads online that may appear to just be get out the vote messages or voter registration messages, but they could just be targeted to such a specific subset of the population through things like micro-targeting, where they could target candidates who are only likely to vote for a specific candidate or only likely to vote in a specific election against a candidate. And even though the content of the ads itself doesn't seem political, by targeting that specific subset to either encourage or in some cases discourage voting, it can be really interesting to reveal messages that you might not know are political on their face by looking at that targeting data. And I'll go into the targeting data more lately, but that's why C3s can be really interesting as well as C4s. 501c4 nonprofits, which are social welfare organizations, are not required to disclose their donors, but in many cases operate very similar to political committees. Those, there's a number of different ones that operate and target New Mexico. You'll see them in political ads on TV, on the radio and digital ads. The main way that we'll get information on those is the Form 990 that's filed every year. That's their annual tax return. There was the exciting extension deadline last week, so I've been running around collecting those forms. Thankfully, with Form 990s, you're able to collect those either from the organization. If you show up, they're legally required to give it to you same day, or if you request them by writing, you have they have 30 days to get back to you. In some cases, it can be a bit harder than others to track down these groups, and we've created some other resources to help with that as well if it turns out the group that you're trying to track down is a 501c4. One of the other documents that's really helpful from the IRS is the Form 1023 or Form 1024. These are the group's applications for tax-exempt status that are filed with the IRS. One of the big caveats to that is that 501c4s have the option of self-declaring with the IRS, which means that they don't have to file one of these documents. They just have to give the IRS notice. While there is some documentation required to be submitted with that notice, the IRS doesn't consider it to be application materials since it's not an application process, it's just notice. So if they've decided to self-declare, you have to wait for their first Form 990, which is not filed until months after their first fiscal year ends, which can leave a lot of gaps if you're trying to get information and reporting out before a specific election, since in many cases, the group won't file anything until months and in some cases more than a year later, which can be a bit difficult. But we have some resources on on ways to expedite those processes and kind of streamline that so you can get the information you need quicker. The far right is more of the real-time exciting political ad filings that we've more recently integrated into our data and are still in the process of integrating. Because so many of those filings, either with the FEC and campaign finance filings, dark money groups don't disclose at all in some cases. And then you have the IRS forms where you might not get the disclosures until months or over a year later. With political ad filings, at least you get a bit more of immediacy with the filings, assuming they're running either ads online, on TV, or on radio. You have at the bottom the Federal Communications Commission. That's the federal agency that TV stations and radio stations are required to submit ad buy filings to. There's a variety of different records that are associated with that I'll go into a bit more depth later. Those would be mainly the record of request filings, the National Association of Broadcasters forms, and the contracts and invoices, but there's a variety of others as well. Those are required to be submitted to the Federal Communications Commission immediately by the stations. However, that's not always the case. Technically, this is the most immediate you can get, at least for TV and radio filings, unless you're going to the ad buyers themselves, which can be a really difficult process and often very expensive. With the Federal Communications Commission filings, we, in some cases, will get filings in advance where we're seeing ads pre-purchased to be aired in 2020, but we also are still getting ads from months ago. And so it really does vary by station, even though the legal requirement is that they're submitted immediately. There's a wealth of information in those filings about the amounts that are being spent by groups that might not disclose elsewhere, as well as in some cases who's behind the group since they're required to disclose their board members, addresses. It really does vary based on station, the level of compliance that the stations and the diligence that they have in terms of ensuring that the filings are complete and accurate. In some cases, stations have so much trouble tracking down the groups that they'll print out pages from OpenSecrets and say, we found this group on OpenSecrets. We've received calls from desperate stations thinking we might be the group that purchased ads from them and trying to get more information about the board members before. So it really does vary. Some stations are very diligent like that. Others, you'll just see filings half filled out and there's very little enforcement on the FCC end for that. More recently, digital ads have become a much bigger presence in political advertising at the federal level as well as the state level and in issue advertising. The main platforms that do disclose and provide databases or libraries of their ad data are Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and Google. Twitter started providing their data last May, but just recently announced that they're going to stop running political ads themselves. That goes into effect tomorrow, actually. And one of the big, there's a variety of different issues with Twitter as a platform for the digital advertising. The first thing is that originally they only included express political campaigning from groups that identified as political campaigners and applied to Twitter. They then very quietly integrated issue advertising but the definitions of what they consider issue advertising versus political campaigning are messy at best. In some cases, groups that were very expressly political, even that showed up in Federal Election Commission data, were missing from Twitter's database. We reported it to them multiple times and they were not responsive. Groups would be missing, groups would go missing, groups would pop up months after the fact, groups would be misclassified as issue advertisers, campaigns showed up as issue advertisers showed up as campaigns, and it was just a very messy database. According to Twitter, they're going to keep up their database from June last year to today's date. And they'll have that at least as kind of a time capsule of what ads ran during that time. So if you're looking for ads kind of backdated, looking at to see what a group ran during that time period, Twitter says that their ad database is going to be kept up, so you'll still be able to access that. But going forward, they said no political ads will be run. Generally, they've provided 7 days of data on non-political advertisers, so things like issue advertising. They're still going to have what's called cause-based advertising. It's not entirely clear what that is. Twitter has provided inconsistent definitions of what that means. If you literally go onto Twitter's Q&A pages, different pages say different things about what that means about things like candidate mentions. One page says that candidates can be mentioned, one says they cannot. So it's not really clear what that's going to mean going forward. One of the oldest tricks in the books for dark money groups with issue advertising and educational advertising that is masquerading as such, but is actually political, is that they just will avoid the word vote for, vote against, but still mention a candidate's painting them in that favorable or disfavorable light. So it's really not clear whether Twitter is going to bar that or not. Right now, the only really clear thing that they've announced is that they're going to bar ads by certain groups. So super PACs, candidates, campaigns, political committees, PACs, elected officials, appointed officials, 501c4s, which is a really interesting choice since those are social welfare organizations, technically not a political group, but they've decided to bar those across the board. However, groups that like 501c3s and 501c6s that might have affiliated PACs, affiliated super PACs, or affiliated C4s are technically still going to be allowed to run cause-based advertising on Twitter. Yes.
Can I ask a question? So Twitter's doing this, if Facebook, this is just a hypothetical, if they adopt something closer to Twitter, will that actually change the flow of money? Because we used to have 527s back in the day, and then C4s became, some of the money went through C4s. Would that change? Like, would you see more stuff from C3s, even though they only have a percentage that, they only can do a certain amount? I mean, if are the social media platforms going to change the flow of money to political ads? So maybe that's the way I should ask.
It's a really tough question. I'm not sure what impact this is going to have yet. Since it goes into effect tomorrow, it's really hard to say what it's going to look like.
Yeah.
There's so many new ways to skirt disclosure rules through social media other than just that big C4 gap. So in addition to 501c4s, especially with Facebook, this is a big issue. And with Twitter, it's hard to know how much of an issue it is because their disclosure is so limited already, is that you'll see these pages pop up. And in some cases, they are very expressly political with their language, but have never registered as a political committee and don't even exist as an incorporated entity. But you'll see groups like I Love Trump 2020, or I Love Senator So-and-so 2018, or abolish the GOP, abolish the Dems. Like, there's a variety of it's hard to construe that type of name of a page in any way other than political, but these groups have never registered as political committees. They don't exist as an incorporated entity. They don't exist as a nonprofit. They don't exist other than on Facebook or Twitter or Google. And that's the ad, and that's not only what the page is listed as, that's usually what the disclaimer is listed as well. And so that's something, and some of these pages, I wish I could say that these are only spending a few $1,000s. We're seeing some of these pages spending millions of dollars on very specifically targeted ads. In some cases, they direct to scam pages where they're hawking things like fake merchandise for campaigns. In other cases, it's list building where They are collecting and harvesting email addresses and phone numbers and data points on people. And you really don't know where that data ends up in some cases, which can be really frightening because it's this no-name, highly politicized page collecting data on voters, spending millions of dollars to do so. So it's obviously lucrative for them, but you don't know who's purchasing that data. In some cases, you can run those names through the FEC filings to see if they're paid as a vendor. Generally, they're not because they don't exist as an organization. Usually it can be a firm behind it, but we don't know. In some cases, there'll be LLCs running ads. But the scariest thing, at least to me, is the groups that operate without a paper trail that don't exist off the internet, that reach hundreds of millions of eyeballs in some cases, that are spending that much, and you don't know what happens there. And that, so again.
Just to jump in on Facebook data, some of these groups will appear in the Facebook data and then disappear. Like,
I actually have an example of that for later on New Mexico targeted. So even sometimes they'll change the disclaimers without telling anyone. So I had an example earlier this week, and this is skipping ahead of it, but it's really interesting, is a Facebook page called Safer and Stronger. All they do is they target New Mexico with oil and gas messaging. And it's really interesting. So actually an example of this exactly, where they changed, not just did they changed the last 3 days in their disclaimers, all of them, no notice, Facebook has no notice. I used this as an example earlier this week with hopes of using it as an example again today, and it's already changed, which is really fascinating. And I will talk more into the mic because I guess people can't hear. I got too excited. But it's fascinating. So you have like the this group called Safer and Stronger. Right now they've only spent about $2,500. So when I looked at this ad just a couple days ago, so I was presenting on something on Tuesday, the ads looked like this, where they said, these ads are run by Safer and Stronger. They have no disclaimer. And they just talk about how being an energy leader and oil and gas and how great it is. If you go to their Facebook page, you also don't have any information. They link to their website. I ended up actually pulling their FCC filings for their TV and radio political ads, which I'll show you later, and ultimately found out that they were funded by the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, which, I mean, makes perfect sense based on this messaging. But if you look at these ads, they have no disclaimer. Now, here's the interesting thing to get to Sarah's point is I just checked these ads before this because I was going to pull up the page. The reason I'm showing you a YouTube video instead of the actual ads is now they include that disclaimer. Someone was listening.
That is so creepy.
As of an hour ago, they include this disclaimer. I presented on this Tuesday, and they did not. I looked at this last week, and they did not. I looked at this when they first started running ads, and they did not. I mentioned it earlier this week, and they now all include the disclaimer quietly. Facebook didn't notify. All of the ads, now backdated, include this disclaimer with no notice of why now all of a sudden these ads say paid for by the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. And so in many cases, it's not just an issue of the groups not being transparent. The platforms aren't necessarily transparent when they make changes, they pull pages. And sorry to interrupt, the example is too on point for that.
They're not only not transparent, they're actually counter-transparent in some ways with like the data changing. The data in their API doesn't match the data in their ad archive. It can be, we will be rolling out Facebook data on OpenSecrets that hopefully will account for some of these issues in February-ish. But it is, even if we do a good job of getting the data from them, I don't have confidence that the data that they're providing is comprehensive. It is what we can work with, but that's, you know, it's a limited world. On top of it, and I don't want to hijack her presentation, but if you look at the Facebook data, there's the way they define political is so both sort of meaninglessly broad and then very specific. You'll see things in the data like Kellogg's Frosted Flakes bought a lot of ads for some reason and they appear in the political ad archive. Like, I don't care unless the ads are about, you know, supporting some politician or a policy platform. It's just, they're just in there because they're mentioning agriculture, probably broadly defined. And so that kind of messiness and in
sort of lack of specificity can make it very hard to really pull out the groups that matter. So it's hairy data, and there are some groups advocating to the platforms that they do more, but the platforms aren't accountable to the public.
And some platforms have been more responsive than others. As much as I'd love to say Facebook is the worst, they're not by an arm and a leg. Twitter by far has been the most sporadic with their various changes and quiet that they don't make announcements. At least Facebook puts some level of announcements out there sometimes. But then you have the examples like Safer and Stronger where people might be none the wiser that the ads were actually paid for by someone with stake in that game. And you'll also see like pages will disappear. They'll change names. There's a variety of different data points that Facebook does provide if you dig through it. But in some cases, the data just changes. So it becomes a challenge. But at least with Facebook, you do get the running ad totals. So how much each group is spending, how much each group is spending on various pages. Technically, you get a paid for disclaimer where you're seeing who's paying for the ads run by those pages. In some cases, those are very much meaningless, where it'll just be the page name paying for it. And that's not really a group or an entity that exists outside of that. In some cases, it can be a fictitious name affiliated with a group where they've registered it with one state, unless you request. In some cases, it's requesting it from the courts in those states to figure out if it's a fictitious name affiliated with them. It really varies in terms of level of disclosure. And with the Federal Election Commission, there's very little requirements for what needs to be included on a Facebook page. So it's really just up to the platforms. We've seen a lot of issues with fake, highly politicized news pages where it really appears to be, in some cases, a local news outlet. And they are, if you looked at it and you didn't know someone else was behind it, it in some cases can look like a news outlet, but with more of a slant to some of the posts. And it really is just absolutely frightening. And I can actually show you what the Facebook database looks like really quickly, just to kind of talk y'all through that. It's skipping ahead a bit, but I think it's an important aspect where you can go in and type in things like New Mexico and other keywords to see who's being mentioned. Again, of course, the top spender here is, or not top spender, but one of the top pages that pops up is the Oil and Gas Association. You can do things like filter from active to inactive, so you can only see ads that are currently running. And again, the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association pops up here from their main page. You can filter by pages, so you can see, in some cases, it's very clearly front groups, and in other cases, it's not. There's another page called Energy Citizens, where it's the American Petroleum Institute. Thankfully, these paid-for disclaimers do work. Earlier, there were some that didn't show up, and those have since been integrated by Facebook. So it looks like they're at least paying attention to a lot of that. But if you saw these on your timeline, you might not know necessarily to look for that. You'll see, let's see. But there's just such a variety of different ones. Like if you go down further, you'll see a lot of just various scammy things, campaigns. In some cases, these just aren't that meaningful. And sometimes those can be the most interesting, are the names that you don't know what they are. And as I mentioned earlier, there's just a lot of energy interest, which in many cases can be code for other things. You'll see actual news sites on here sometimes, which is kind of getting to Sarah's point that Facebook's definition is just overly broad in some cases, but also just very much meaningless because sometimes news shows up and sometimes it doesn't. And it really just varies. When you go to the individual ad data, those can be really interesting as well. You can see some targeting data on men, women, unknown gender targeting. And to be very clear, this is who actually sees the ad, not necessarily who they were deliberately trying to target. In many cases, the ads are targeted based on characteristics that are picked out, things like what pages a person likes, what their activity is like online, that type of thing, which can be really interesting. But you don't get that information. You don't know what specific specific criteria they were looking for. So if you see this, you just kind of see the general demographic data, whereas in reality, it could be that they were saying, I want people who are very, very likely to vote for this specific candidate. I found that they like that people who vote for this candidate like these 20 pages. We target people based on people who like these 20 pages. Yes.
What you're showing us now, you went to this page and then you just typed in New Mexico.
I did. Yes, and so just since I skipped ahead a bit, all of these are linked at the bottom of the guide page for OpenSecrets New Mexico portal. We link to Facebook's ad library, Google's ad library, and then Twitter's for their archive of the past since like June to today's date. There's also, just to go back up for one more platform that does disclose, is Snapchat. I don't link to their library because I think it's too messy for the average user, and I eventually want to do a little bit more with that. Snapchat released their political ad data from June of last year to date. They update it supposedly on a daily basis, but the way that they provide the filings is as bulk CSVs that are available as the files are all named the same. They're Excel files within CSVs that you have to download. You can't even open them at the same time since they have the same date, and it's just a very messy system. But Snapchat's data can be really interesting as well because you can see what specific regions, what states are targeted, as well as more specific targeting data, such as you can get into very specifics like what TV shows people like. We'll see a lot of like certain news shows, talk shows even, reality TV. You'll see specific things like college students with debt, bored single moms. Like it's like really weird specific targeting data that you can get down to, as well as things like more general data like geographical data, age ranges, gender. But in terms of impressions and the more advanced targeting data with Snapchat, you can get down to these really very specific subsects of the population. And so that can be really interesting. With Snapchat, you also have just less traditional ads for the vast majority of the world that doesn't understand how any of that works, because I have only learned from looking at these political ads. You have things like the normal videos, what you would typically expect with a political ad, but you also have things like filters where where they'll pay to have a filter put that can either be like a mask or a color or some type of logo, and people can take their picture or a video with it. And it can be very specifically targeted to geographical areas, time periods, and people. So you can have things like filters around debates where people can either take videos of themselves watching a debate or of the TV, and it'll change someone's face or do something to it. But it can be very specifically targeted to populations that are likely to like their candidate in the debate, so that it amplifies their message beyond just the people watching on TV to put it in their Snapchat story. And so those can be really interesting. It can be really.
I have children who use Snapchat, so when you're talking about the masks and stuff, that's part of the thing. And
I'm probably horribly explaining it. I don't fully understand Snapchat, but that's the gist of the political ads.
Snapchat generally, I think, probably applies to a younger.
It does. A lot of the targeting there. So to give context, with Facebook, a lot of the targeting we'll see is 65 and over. With Snapchat, the oldest age range I've seen targeted by political ads is 35 and over. Whereas the youngest is 13 and up.
But the reason I kind of reacted is because I've always heard marketing, the best marketing you can do in the world is, I tell Morgan that this is great, and then he tells somebody it's like old school kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And Snapchat is actually, hey, put a mask around this and spread this. That's kind of like old school marketing there.
It is. A lot of digital has been a return to making people your messengers almost with that type of thing. And that's something we've seen across the board with Instagram, which is a subset of Facebook. We've seen a lot of that as well. A lot of that isn't encapsulated in the political ad data, which I find really interesting. Looking from like a lot of what I do is also foreign influence. We've seen foreign governments. One of my favorite examples is Saudi Arabia, where they offer influencers through various social media platforms free trips to Saudi Arabia on very well curated agendas, where they only see the things that Saudi Arabia wants to promote to an international audience. And they take people on these amazing trips, they wine and dine them, but they're not allowed to leave this specific agenda, and they're encouraged to take pictures. So that instead of the images coming directly from a Saudi government account, you're seeing them from your favorite person you follow for fashion advice or world travel tips. And generally there's no disclaimers because it's not like they're being paid, they're just being wined and dined. And there may be some policies on that, but on average, disclaimers don't show up with those. And so you, in some cases, can see that probably one of the more interesting and innovative outside of the major platforms there was an app that was developed that created a game for people where users were encouraged to like and retweet things and share things on their various social media platforms. And there would be little tasks you were provided, quests, where your quest was to share something or promote it or amplify it. And generally it was political messages or like some type of issue advocacy or various influence related messaging, and you would get points for that and you'd win the game. And it gets down to very things you wouldn't know to look for. It becomes increasingly hidden once you get into the digital space. And so that can be really interesting, whereas at least with like Facebook and Twitter and Google, it's a little bit easier to grasp for the average person, since in many cases the digital ads do look like what you would expect. With Google, you have the banner ads, you have video ads on things like YouTube, you have images that can pop up. But even in some cases with those, they're very well disguised where they can look like organic content. But the big caveat is these are just 4 platforms. Political ads online don't just show up on 4 platforms. There's a wealth of other platforms, some of which do allow political ads and have no policy or disclosure that's public. Places like Hulu, Reddit, I'm trying to think of a few other examples where they allow political ads on some level, but they have no disclosure data. They have no library, and we've seen that as an attraction even for some groups that have been very open, that's why they want to put things on there, which is wild to me that they would tout that. But then you also have another subset of platforms where they don't technically allow political ads, or they restrict them or block them in some way, but there's still ways around it on those platforms. You have platforms like, I'm trying to think of a good example. A lot of video platforms have that issue where where you can kind of create a channel like Twitch type of things and get around the restrictions very quickly. LinkedIn being another example where they're not allowed to have political ads, but candidates can post and encourage people to amplify them, and then amplify them through other platforms that then amplify them through LinkedIn. And you get into just some very complicated plans in that way, which is why in some cases it can be so either expensive or require a level of skill that isn't as typical for political campaigns and political groups, which has created a whole new cottage industry of people monetizing on this. Just to move on, I think that's most of the data points, and just to get into like at least what our platform provides for searchability. To go back to the more basic ads, we've created a search ad data tab of the Federal Communications Commission data. This is the TV and radio political ad filings. So this is specific for New Mexico here. Where we integrated all of the ad filings. We have a tool called addata.org that looks at the entire country, that multiple times a day pulls data from the Federal Communications Commission on TV and radio ads and puts them, makes them full text searchable in a way that people are able to access them. To give some background on this, about two or 3 years ago, none of this existed. Federal Communication Commission disclosure files were generally on file with the stations themselves, and you had to physically go get them in many cases or go on the station's websites. This was just a mismatch of various disclosure levels and requirements. I personally went to stations to get the filings, and it was always an adventure. With places like Verizon, I went and apparently during that day had trained one of their poor high school student who worked there part-time how to show me the political ads. I wasn't allowed to see the screen that he was searching from, and so I had to tell him what terms to search from on the screen at the random Verizon store. And I was searching for a super PAC called Baby Got PAC. And I felt really bad for this poor kid because I was trying to find these very specific ads. After about an hour and a half, we gave up. And so that was what it was like a few years ago. Since then, the FCC has at least made a lot of progress. They have required that stations pretty much across the board, other than a few very small areas, disclose directly to the FCC, and the stations have to actually give their filings to the FCC, and then the FCC makes those available on their website. The FCC's website itself is very clunky. You have to search by station generally. They do have a full text search, but it's not great, and it's riddled with issues and omissions in many cases. And you really have to know what you're looking for to find the specific station and the specific ad and the specific date, and it just varies. We've taken all of that data and we've put it all in one place so that you're able to do a full text search here. So you can search for things like either a candidate name or a term that shows up in an ad. So to give Safer, Stronger New Mexico an example, this was one of the ways that I was able to track down that they were part of the that they were paid for by the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, is you can see that they have things like invoices, and you can click on those and you can actually see the filings themselves. This is an example of what's called an NAB. And an NAB is the National Association of Broadcasters filing. This is what's generally on file with a station when an advertiser begins to run ads. It provides the basic information about who's requesting the ad, their address, the date that that's being requested, what the station is. In this case, it's an FM radio station, as well as who the time is being used by, whether or not an issue of national importance is referenced. I wouldn't trust this section. In some cases, they say there's no issue of national importance, and it's literally about an issue of national legislation or an issue or a national election. So it varies how they decide to disclose this, because in some cases, the same ad will run in multiple places and different boxes will be checked. And you'll generally get a list of the chief executives, members of executive committee, or a board of directors. Yeah.
Look through this filing on there, you'll see that Claire Chase is the chairman of NMOGA. And I believe Claire Chase is just declared, right? Isn't she a candidate for the 2nd district? Yeah. So that's an important connection right there. I don't know, that's probably already been reported, but it's very interesting. Well, she's a chairman of NMOGA, and so. No, but it's interesting. That's just a data point to make sure in reference. Yeah.
This is all a very good point about why we're trying to do platforms like this, because those names don't mean anything to us.
Yeah, but to us,
but to you,
to local folks, you can.
We think local journalism is critical for getting to the bottom of a lot of these national stories.
One of the nice things about this platform being so full text searchable is that you can also search for people's names. So you could actually search and see if perhaps she might be a member of another board. With people who are ad buyers, one of the ways that we were able to track coordination in some cases is a campaign and a super PAC hired different firms, because in many cases they're not allowed to coordinate, at least at the federal level, and in many cases the state level. They'll hire different firms with the exact same employees, where one firm doesn't really exist and is just a fictitious copy of the other firm. You can search the names of the actual employee ad buyers in here and see where they show up in the same filings, that type of thing. And if that was really confusing, please let me know, and I'm happy to explain that in more detail. But in many cases, you can search individuals, see if someone shows up for another ad filing, search the firm that's purchasing it to see what other groups might have hired that firm to purchase their ads, search addresses to see for shared addresses.
Excuse
me. Yes.
So I'm seeing a filed by Comcast of New Mexico / Pennsylvania, but Comcast is a cable company, right? So they don't have to abide by FCC filing rules, do they?
They do. Cable companies do now. So it's cable, digital TV, broadcast TV, satellite, as well as like some digital TVs do. Hulu doesn't show up on here, but ones that are broadcast do. Anything that's broadcast, as well as FM and AM radio. That should all show up on here. And it should show you, like, if you click the station on here, it'll show you more details about the stations themselves. And you can actually, like, see what kind of station they are. How do I go back?
Yeah, these are federal rules that apply to local stations. All
That's
stations.
correct.
But it would include political advertising for local candidates. Is that right?
That is correct. All of the local advertising shows up in here as well. And not just candidates, also issue advertising, which is one of the big advantages. You can see things like ballot initiatives. If they're running TV or radio ads, you'll see any type of local issue that an ad is running for where that was classified as an issue ad. So that can be really interesting in some cases. You'll see, we see a lot of like city council races. You'll see local groups, sometimes nonprofits show up in here that wouldn't show up in the federal data at all. And so that can be really interesting. And you can search for those based on the names of the groups, their addresses, individuals who are on their board, search for the firms that they're paying. And the nice thing with all of this is you do actually get the contracts and the invoices so that you can see a full accounting of how much they're spending in those cases as well, which is nice.
And just to be clear, so you've got the US government requiring this of broadcasters and cablecasters, but on the social media platforms, that's just voluntary?
It's voluntary that the platforms do it, yes. Yeah. Technically, those do include a lot of local as well, but it really does, as I mentioned earlier, vary. Some consider local elections to be issue advertising. I believe Twitter is one of those. So you probably may still see local ads on there. Others consider it to be political. Some, it really does vary. In some places, there are additional restrictions placed on them at the local level. I believe California recently passed some new rules, Maryland, Seattle. There's a few other states. I wouldn't want to misrepresent which ones they are, where they've created additional requirements that the tech platforms have to follow. And so there's additional disclosure for some of those. One of the more interesting one is where the disclaimer has to provide who's actually behind the group and who like the top funders are. And so you'll see these like long paid for disclaimers with like multiple different names on there, but it really does vary. And that's all entirely voluntary on the tech platforms. That's up to them. It's not up to the government. The one thing that you will see in government filings for tech platforms would be the express advocacy at the federal level.
I might be getting ahead of you, but I remember last year when you guys were here, you were showing how you could find these filing PDFs and then go find the video on like YouTube.
You can, yes. In many cases you can. There's also, if you're looking at the federal level, 538 has a really great database that they're putting together just of campaigns. So it's very much limited to that, but they put all of the spending totals and the actual campaign ads in there all in one place, which is really nice. But you can usually go and try to track down what those ads are. In this case with Safer and Stronger, it's really easy because they're also running digital ads. And so you're able to kind of go back to their Facebook page and see what videos they posted. And in this case, most of these are the ads that showed up in those filings, which of course we're having trouble playing videos. But you can actually find those ads. And in the case of the going back to the NAB, you can usually see what the issue is if they do decide it's an issue of national importance. So I'm trying to think of a good example of one of the issues that would be national importance, so they'd have to list it. Would be, I mean, you can honestly search things like energy or oil or any other, that is not how you spell energy. You can search pretty much any type of issue and see either who's mentioning it in their name, or who's mentioning it in the ad itself. And in some cases here, you'll also get things like complaints, which is kind of interesting. Like this is correspondence where they were requesting that they stop air an ad, which is kind of, can sometimes be colorful. We've seen some ads where there were claims that there were falsehoods in them. And so those can be kind of interesting. Does anyone have a term that they want to see what happens when we search it?
Methane.
Methane? All right, let's see.
Quick aside, does this apply to radio too?
Yes, it does. Yeah, so you'll see AM and FM in here as well, usually. It doesn't include generally things like Sirius, that type of stuff. I don't think. I would have to double check. Don't think, yeah, no. So if you are looking for something that airs on other radio, it doesn't, but with what you're hearing like in your car radio, it would. And so going back to methane, you can see, oh, interesting. So in this case, this is like a random document from the station outlining what they had done over the past 5 or 6 years. And some of that included, they say they didn't do any political ads, but here's the interviews they did, and some of those include methane, which is kind of a weird first result. You can also...
Entertainment form? What is that? What's the form?
This is just a letter from them. In some cases, these aren't forms, they're just letters, which can be kind of frustrating. The main forms, just to give a better sense of that, are the NAB that I was showing earlier, where you have this. You can search for NAB and I'll show you, this is what generally has the name, address, treasurer, board. You also can compare signatures. Those aren't OCR'd, so they're not full test searchable, but in some cases seeing who's purchasing the same ads for different groups can be interesting with signatures. You also have record of request, which is very similar to the National Association of Broadcasters form. This includes the date of the request, the agency, which is usually the firm that's paid, but in some cases they just list the organization. The address, 66 Canal here, 66 Canal houses a number of different dark money groups as well as various conservative firms, and used to house a couple super PACs and campaigns as well, all within one large office space with overlapping desks. So that's a really interesting address that's worth noting. You also have the name of the agency contact making the request. This is the person who's employed by the firm generally. In some cases, it's the organization directly making it, but usually it is a middleman and they require a firm, they hire a firm for that. You have the organization purchasing the time. Here it's Safer Stronger. They did actually disclose in all of their FCC filings that it's the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, or MMOGA, which was kind of a good giveaway for their Facebook page when it didn't have that information. And then you'll have the list of chief executive officers, board of directors, or group. Here it's only partial. And then you have a description of the issue presented. That's one of the advantages of the record of request versus the NAB, is even if it's just a local or a state level issue, generally it does actually show up in the record of request, even though it is often not listed in the National Association of Broadcasters filing. You also have a question about whether or not it relates to an election. If it does, they have to name the candidate, the party affiliation, and the office sought. Stations sometimes vary as to whether or not this includes issue ads that just mention a candidate who's running. And so sometimes that will show them and sometimes it won't. You see whether it was accepted or rejected. Generally they're accepted. In some cases they're just not accepted yet. If they do reject it, they have to give a reason for rejection. And then you have the signature of the person at the station who received the request and the date there. In this case, you can kind of see a bit of the lag. This was submitted on August 15th, and it didn't show up. Oh, it showed up August 16th, so that's a pretty quick turnaround for when the station actually submitted it to the FCC, which is nice. And then you have contracts and invoices. These can look like a variety of things. So we have like Tom Steyer for president here, which would be his campaign. That is sideways. I don't want to show you that one. really sideways from the station. There's no real consistency of whether stations have to submit things upwards even, which is frustrating. We used to get a lot more handwritten ones. Now at least that they have to submit to the FCC through their online interface. Usually they're at least typed, which is nice now. But sometimes you'll still get station notes, which can sometimes be interesting. We've seen stations correct the ad buyers in some cases where if an ad is mentioning a candidate and running close to an election, the people will say the issue is the environment or energy or America. And then the station will cross that out and they'll say, no, it's this Senate election. No, it's this House election. And that's always really refreshing to see stations actually taking that level of diligence. So those are always worth checking the notes as well. If you do see handwritten notes, generally that's the station that's going in there and fixing stuff. It varies on the station. Some stations are really good about it. And I don't know if it's because they're more staffed or just have more time on their hands. But some stations, some of them are ones that we've talked to in the past and now have started doing it. My hometown stations are really great at it because I had called them with questions a few times. And now I see them from them constantly, whereas other stations don't. Don't be afraid to contact your local station if you're looking for some, or contact the station behind an ad. They vary in terms of level of responsiveness as well as their level of diligence, but in many cases, they just don't know the rules. They don't know that they're supposed to be doing more or that they could do more. And so even just taking it upon yourself to educate them a bit can sometimes be really helpful. There's so many stations, it's not like we could call everyone, but if you're particularly interested in one, the station contact information is all listed and required to be disclosed to the FCC. I've generally had pretty good luck with stations. And sometimes that made them more responsive, but it really varies from one station to the next. Some will see them every week they've corrected something, whereas others, they're just riddled with errors and omissions. Yes?
Just to be clear, the NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters, they just provide the form, right? They're not really involved in the collection of the...
Correct. That's just one of the forms. Right. Those are the two main ones for the initial one, a record of request and NAB. Stations are not required to use standardized forms, though, so it really does vary by station. In some cases, they've created their own custom version of the ROR or of the NAB form. In some cases, they just kind of assume people will submit things like by email, and they just have like emails that they've printed out. It really does vary pretty considerably from one station to the next, but those are the two general ones that are used. You'll also see things like invoices with bigger companies like Comcast. Those are pretty standard across the board, where different Comcasts across the country will usually use similar forms that are branded in similar format. But with other stations, it really, even things as little as invoices and contracts can vary pretty considerably. Yes.
On that point, I actually just found a letter from a candidate asking for airtime from the PBS station.
We have a lot of those. We'll see emails even, and sometimes handwritten notes back in the day.
Yeah, I'd like 3 hours to basically, you know.
There you go, Matt.
Tell me we said no.
Sometimes that happens. So one of the more interesting examples, we look at ads around events too. One of the nice things with the full text search is you can search for things like debate or a Super Bowl and look for ads around that. I was looking at a lot of Super Bowl ads for last year or this year, and I contacted one of the more obscure groups that it looked like they tried to purchase airtime and then they never showed up. And I called the group and the guy was like, please don't print this, but we just couldn't afford it. We contacted them and we realized how much it would cost. And so I didn't include them in my story because I just felt bad for them. And they really weren't that notable. But we were hoping there was some more obscure, exciting reason. And that was not the case. They just couldn't afford the ads. So in some cases, it's not a nefarious reason. Then something doesn't ultimately show up. It might not be rejected. It might just be change of circumstance in some cases. Sometimes groups will also assign ads to other groups. Those can be really weird filings. And I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head where the same firm might be employed by multiple different groups and one group decides they don't want the airtime and so another group gets it. And so there'll be like this switch off. In some cases it can be between dark money groups and campaigns they support, where it may or may not look like the dark money group kind of held space open for the campaign in case they wanted it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And in many cases, you'll see, if you look at the times, you'll also see, so this is like an example of one of the invoices. If you go down, you'll see the zones that they're put, the spots. You'll also, in some cases, see for TV ads, you'll see what shows they show up on. So you'll have like news shows in some cases, like CNN or evening news. Gosh, I hope some of that's up right. Oh, here's a good example of writing on a form by one of the stations. And I guess they were trying to math and figure things out. I don't even know here.
Can I ask you a question about the hypothetical, or actually it sounds like you've run into this, where a dark money group might have held time at a station for a candidate?
It's hard to tell if that was actually the case, but we've seen it transfer over through the same firm before a couple
Yeah,
times.
and so that's where you couldn't, because you don't know what they're thinking, right?
Right.
Coordination, so you can't say anything. It's just interesting.
Right, but in some cases you can more specifically pinpoint potential coordination with things like, so shared ad buyers is one of the things the Federal Election Commission looks for, where there are very elaborate plans, it appears, to hide shared ad buyers. Those can be interesting. The example from earlier where there were shared individuals, where the same individual was signing forms by a campaign and a group supporting them within, in some cases within hours of each other, buying ads that appeared to mirror each other, where they like either were at the exact same periods or had almost identical patterns from between the campaigns and the groups supporting them, whether it be dark money groups or super PACs or other types of groups. When they do have the same individual signing off on the same ads on the same days in a way that appears to exhibit the exact same pattern, you can't say definitively that that's coordination, but it is what the FEC looks to as evidence of coordination in some cases. And the ways that we were able to search for those would be things like, and I'll use our regular search tool because I'm not familiar with examples of this happening in New Mexico. Because I'm just less familiar with a lot of the local groups, but to give you an example on the federal level, there's a place called Slater's Lane in Arlington that houses multiple, that houses multiple different firms that are just fictitious names of each other. And so you'll see the same agency in some cases running ads under the American Media and Advocacy Group, but you'll also see the same a firm called Red Eagle. And in many cases, you'll see that they're located at the exact same location. And so you can just search for things like Slater's Lane and see all of the different firms that show up there. One of the more interesting examples, though, that we ended up coming across was where not only did they have the fictitious firms all at the same location, they ended up having another shell company called Harris Sykes LLC located right outside of the city that was not listed as a fictitious entity originally, but employed all of the exact same individuals, where you could see, I'm trying to remember the specific name of a person who was there signing off on things, but basically you could search for the names of the individuals, you could search for the names of the streets, that type of thing. But it's a matter of actually looking through the individual filings and seeing who is purchasing them, who's signing the filings in some cases. And we were able to track the signatures that way because we do have the full text search. I believe Thomas Farrell was one of, but it can just get really in the weeds very quickly with that. Trying to see if there's a more recent example of these. Like this is one of the more recent ones where you don't even have the name of the person for this one. You just have like Harris Sykes. But in many cases, we were seeing the same signatures show up within a few hours of each other. So it's a matter of like searching the same names over and over again, seeing them for various entities. Like if you have the know-how, if you like are familiar with what groups are supporting a candidate, and what are closely aligned, then those can be really helpful. And I know we're getting a little crunch for time, so I just wanna make sure to get through all the tools on the actual panel really quickly. We also have a new filings tab in addition to the search ad data, where you can just see the most recent filings in New Mexico and see who's been purchasing ads here. Did that go back? Those should be open. But you can actually see like who the most recent filings are, and you can open those filings. And you can also search the main page. This is limited to like the top 100 filings, but it'll give you, it's updated multiple times a day, and will give you like the most recent filings as they come into the Federal Communications Commission. We also have a nonprofits tab. This is updated once every month with data that we draw directly from the IRS. They release this thing called the Business Master File every month with every new group that is approved for tax exempt status. So this can be everything from 501c3s to 501c4s to other types of 501c nonprofits. The caveat to this is it's only groups that do apply and are approved for tax exempt status to the IRS. But this, we update this every month. You can download it as data. The CSV file has more data on the groups, contact information, that type of stuff, at least what they've provided to the IRS. And these are all the new groups as they're approved within the state of New Mexico. We limited this to just groups that are in New Mexico, but as I mentioned earlier with Delaware-based groups, those are always worth checking as well. And since in some cases groups that might only operate in New Mexico might try to hide their existence with a Delaware shell entity. And you can just kind of search through here. Most of these are just going to be really normal nonprofits, but in some cases you might find more highly politicized groups that are masquerading as such. So if you see a group that has like, I guess, code words almost for politicized things like energy in many cases, or patriots, or progressive, or I love America, or New Mexicans for, or Americans for, are oftentimes innocuous enough that they can be used by dark money groups that are really political groups. And so those are keywords that kind of you'll start, once you really look, it really varies a little bit by state, but at least on the federal level, and at least to some extent here, we've seen a lot of those terms pop up again and again, and you'll probably have a lot more to add to the list if you follow this closely. And we'd update this every month. Usually the IRS loads their new data towards the middle of the month. So usually like right now on the 15th or so, you'll see new groups pop up here. And you can see the approval date. There hasn't been new data yet for this month, or this is the one from the end of last month that just popped up. They update it 15 days, usually like around 15 days, like mid-month for the last month. So these are the new ones that came in. We just updated this like 2 days ago since the IRS loaded the data then.
You can't click on those to get more information.
No, but you can download the CSV file, and it has a wealth of information on the groups as well. It has all the IRS data. There wasn't a good way to portray it there because the IRS provides a lot of different data on them. That said, the one thing that's really interesting about the groups that if you're really digging into one specific that you would want to do is request the information from the group themselves. In many cases, because the groups are approved for tax exempt status, you can request their application materials. In some cases, it's a really long, drawn-out process. My favorite's Crossroads GPS. I have their tax exempt materials on my desk still from a couple of years ago. They were literally thousands of pages of documents of their back and forth trying to get tax exempt status. And in some cases it's a couple pages, in some cases it's more. It can reveal things like seed donors, like initial board members, operatives that are working for them, their actual messaging, like what they really intended the group to do rather than what they are portraying the group is doing. And so those can be just a wealth of knowledge. In many cases, these groups won't have tax returns for at least another year and a half. And so this is like at least the first initial information, and this is a good alert for knowing that they're incorporated generally in New Mexico. In some cases, they might have incorporation records in other states as well. So it's worth checking something like Open Corporates for that too. To get the 1024 form, I went over this earlier, but just to reiterate, you can either request that directly from the group. If you go in person, they have to give it to you same day. If you request it in writing from the group, they have to give it to you within the month. And all the information about who you would be requesting that from is in the CSV file generally, or at least they're like, not the easiest information to get it from, but like addresses, that type of thing where you would send stuff. Or you can file a Form 506A with the IRS. This can be used to either request 990s or to request the 1024 or 1023 form. And I actually created a graphic earlier that I forgot to upload to this about how to request 990s, but I'll send that around with like a follow-up to all this. And this is like where you can get the form from the IRS. They require you to fax it, which is really frustrating. If anyone doesn't have access to a fax machine, let me know. I'm happy to help with this because I request these day in and day out. I have this great thing called MetroFax that lets me fax through the internet rather than having to deal with paper. And so I submit hundreds of document requests to the IRS every year for 990s. And so that's a really easy way to do it. So if anyone needs help requesting, I'm always around. You also have the campaign finance tab, which I'll go over very quickly because we're about cut time, but Sarah went over most of this earlier, but we just made it a little bit more accessible for people since we have the portal here. We wanted people to just be able to click over and see the campaign finance information for New Mexico. This includes all of the 2020 Senate races, House races, all the candidates that are coming up, all of the main outside spending in those races, and is updated as regularly as our other data throughout the site. You can also click the links and get to the main New Mexico congressional race pages and get more in-depth information on the data about what groups are out there, what candidates are running, that type of thing. And Sarah showed you all of that earlier, but it's linkable from this page that you can click everything in one location. And with the next 5 to 6 minutes, if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Make sure it's online.
Yes, if anyone online has questions as well, please unmute yourself and we're happy to answer. Sure. They have a way of questions.
Oh, you stopped sharing the screen.
Did we? Did I just stop sharing the screen?
Up top at the red, yeah, there you go.
Sorry. Does anyone have questions online? If you do, please unmute yourself. And otherwise, if anyone has questions here in the meantime, I am around. Yes.
So you might have addressed this, sorry if you did, but
no, you're
good. You go to new filings on the New Mexico part?
Yes.
There's that list of all the filings. If I click on one, it sends me to the summary page.
I just noticed that. I'm not sure. We were having some data issues earlier today, so I'm going to check on that as soon as we're out of here, why it's not directing to the filings themselves. All of these filings are also searchable and available through the Search Filings tab right now, but we're going to get that fixed as soon as we're out of here. It worked this morning. I'm not sure what happened today. Sorry about that. But that should technically just direct to the filings the same way the Search Filings tab does. Yes.
So it sounds like a chunk of this is just like familiarizing ourselves with it, going here, once a week or daily, depending, just to understand what these forms look like, where the information is that we need. Is that would you recommend that, or is there a more efficient way of sort of learning the language, so to speak?
Gosh, it's really hard because it is so station specific, at least with the forms. I generally don't checking the new filings tab every so often can be good, but also if there's certain key terms, like depending on what your beat is or certain candidates or individuals you want to follow, also just like bookmarking the search for that can be really a good feature. For me, like there's certain either names or individuals, like if I'm searching for things like debate, whatever, searching for that, whatever the story of the week already is, that can be really useful. Because you can search for something as little, and I know people can't see this, but I want them to be able to call it, but you can search for something as simple as like debate and see like last night's Dem debate. You can actually see like what ads are purchased for debates and see where in some cases they might have listed, this actually for the last CNN debate, what ads they purchased, what times, what they were targeting, who was buying them, that type of thing. And so that can be really interesting. And so usually like around the debates, I'll just bookmark search debate, or I'll like pin it as a tab, or if you're following a specific candidate or whatnot, looking for that type of thing. But other than that, it's just a matter of skimming. If you're trying to like find what the next big story is, it usually is just kind of looking for those or looking for key big thing, like keywords that might be bigger indicators. And of course, in terms of figuring out the filings themselves, if you're trying to calculate something, if you're trying to look for something specific and it just, even if it's just something little and you want a tip, I'm always just an email away, and I'm always happy to help with that too. My email, I think most people should have that, is just anna@crp.org, anna@crp.org. I'm an email away if anyone needs anything. And I'm always happy to help talk people through forms because I've looked through so many of them. And with like calculating the totals, sometimes that can be tricky because there's like gross amounts and there's discounted amounts and that type of stuff. So if you're trying to calculate the totals based on FCC filings or even on digital ad filings, in some cases it can be a little confusing. I'm always happy to help with like standardizing the math, that type of stuff, whether it be talking you through how to do it or helping out and do it out on our end. Any other questions? Yes.
Are you doing this for other states, or are we just the lucky ones?
You are the lucky first. New Mexico is our pilot project. We are hoping to expand this to as many other states as possible. We think the tools are really useful, that there's just a wealth of information that's untapped at the state level. New Mexico has made so much progress, like with regulatory changes recently. There was the opportunity to connect with funders as well as partners at the state level. We're so grateful for New Mexico In Depth being part of this, as well as the Thornburg Foundation and our other fundraising partners. We're hoping to expand. If you have ideas or suggestions for partners in other states, we're always looking. We're hoping to do more of that and really use this, but right now New Mexico is our testing ground. We're hoping to continue in New Mexico and continue adding more tools to the New Mexico database. Really want to integrate more digital ad data now that that's something that we're starting to explore more, as well as just keeping tools up to date. So as you have feedback on the tool, if you explore it, we would love to hear any suggestions or ideas you have, whether they're pie in the sky ideas of, it would be great if you just had all the things, to really specific detailed feedback. We're working to tweak the tool to make it as useful as possible. We are to help y'all, and we want it to actually be useful. So feedback, ideas, anything is welcomed.
The New Mexico portal will probably be the first place we show Google targeting data, as we were talking about this morning as a test. But to get this in other states, we kind of need the trifecta of us, a partner, and a funder. So, you know, it all happened to come together with our, you know, excellent development team and Anna's expertise here, but hopefully other states soon.
We're kind of, I mean, in some ways, we're kind of, like you said, testing ground, whatever, how this works. We communicate like this is great and that helps you guys, right?
Oh, certainly. We want to be helpful to y'all. We want to create the tools, but this has been such a great learning experience for us. It's given us a chance to see what's helpful to state and local journalists, because I mean, as we mentioned earlier, we're not as familiar with the groups at the state level, but we're also just not as familiar with the needs that it takes to follow a lot of this. There's such a wealth of information that can not just help us to help journalists at the state and local level, but also can inform a lot of our work in federal politics. Just hearing about what types of figures and stuff in disclosure works for y'all, what complaints they are, things about everything from like the employer being listed to what usability, like how to search, that type of thing. Like, it's so helpful to us to have that feedback and be able to bring it back and make our site better and more useful to people. We want to help as much as possible and have the information cited and have it out there. And right now, hopefully we're at least in the right direction for that. Yes.
Sorry, keep
no, please, the questions are welcome.
Two last like specific questions. One was Instagram, whether that's included in the face plan?
Yes, it is. And right now, Facebook just released recently the ability to toggle by platform. So you can actually, and I can pull this up really quickly, you can actually see what platform things are run on. So you can see all platforms. You'll see Facebook, Instagram, the Audience Network, and Messenger. And I'm not entirely sure what Audience Network is. I think it's like more of their selling platform. I'm not entirely sure on that. I haven't really explored those yet, but you can filter for Instagram as well and see what ads were on there. As well as like all the other things, which is kind of nice. And with Google, that also includes things like YouTube. And Snapchat's a Snapchat. Yes, any other questions? I don't think we've gotten anything in from online.
Do you get calls from journalists, and then do you sort of like work closely with them in reporting?
We do. Various states, we've had more relationships with others. Sometimes we've like partnered on reporting projects on various state level things. We've done a lot because FCC data and like digital ad data is so new with partnering with journalist outlets on there. We have one in-house staff writer and reporter at OpenSecrets who has co-authored some things with various state outlets. We also co-publish things, that type of stuff, but we also just help and provide data. And so if you ever need just like bulk FCC stuff or whatever, we always can send that over. We can talk you through how to use it, how to calculate things. That's why we exist, is to help people to use our data. And so anytime I'm a phone call or email away, always happy to schedule time to chat.
If you're not sure who to email, just press@crp.org will get you to the press office. And I'm on that distro, even though I'm not in press, we'll forward it to the person that we know is the best or in-office person to talk to about that issue.
Yes.
I was just going to say that I think it was earlier, maybe it was last year, I called you guys up, and somebody on staff is from New Mexico, or it used to be.
Yeah, we actually have an intern and a staffer right now from New Mexico.
And they actually, we used our openness project and you guys to look at who was receiving money from private prison operators in the state. And most of the money, and this is during the whole separating children from in the border. And of course, the Democrats were getting the most money from the private prison operators, who actually were helping the administration in its whole immigration thing. And so you do that. We published a story, and then the Journal followed, and then they were giving away. A lot of these guys were giving $50,000 in campaign contributions to charities after that. I mean, you guys were very helpful in kind of helping.
I'm really glad to hear that. There's so many different applications of our data that we might not always think about. So I'm always excited to see like new stories like that where you have creative uses of the data. It's always interesting to see it have an impact too.
Yeah, when you ever write a story that uses our data that does have an impact, send it to us.
Yes, anytime you write a story using our data, we would love to.
We could promote,
especially like any of our like New Mexico's like data and anything else on here. We would love to be able to like promote that. So anytime you use our data, and we were hoping to keep track of like whether or not this is a good project. We want it to keep going and have proof that it's having an impact. But we'd also love to promote like whatever stories you have that do use the data. So anytime, send them my way, and I'm always just curious to read them. So.
Well, we don't want to keep you.
Yes, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone on the phones who's still left over. If there is anyone, we're going to go on and end the call. Thank you so much for joining today. And thank you to the University of New Mexico for hosting us. Let's see if that works.
It's on the bottom right.
Sorry, thank you all.